The sea begins where the last light fades, and the whisper of water becomes a language of its own. You drive on, or you fold laundry, and somewhere beneath, the world grows quieter and stranger by the meter. Down there, pressure is a slow, relentless hand reshaping life into forms that read like poetry in a language we are only learning to translate. Every meter down is another world waiting to be found. Subscribe and write in the comments what speaks to you more, the mystery below or the life that dares to survive it. As you listen, imagine descending through blue into purple and then into a black so deep it seems older than night. Sound behaves differently here. It carries and distorts, a low, sonorous hum that seems to belong to the bones of the planet. Creatures there make music we cannot yet fully interpret, clicks, knocks, and a soft bioluminescent humming that punctuates the dark like distant lanterns. The abyss is not empty. It is a crowded library of strange survival strategies written in tissue, chitin, and shell. Some animals grow slow and patient, stretching out life across years, decades, sometimes centuries. Others are bursts of furious activity, ancestors of lightning, existing in brief, brilliant flashes that end as quickly as they began. Take bioluminescence, for example, the city lights of the deep. It is a chemical fire, a conversation in light, used to lure, to confuse, to mate, and to escape. Tiny organisms flare like punctuation marks, whole animals bloom into constellations, and predators use these flashes as trapdoor illusions that pull prey into their waiting mouths. Between these glows swim the anglerfish, the viper of the deeps, famous for a luminous lure that wavers above a cavernous jaw. But the angler is not merely a predator, it is a steady and evolutionary invention. Males fuse to females in some species, becoming living tissue, a tiny organ supplying sperm and nothing more, while the female carries the world alone in her teeth. Beyond spectacle, the deep sea holds communities anchored to thermal oases, where water spurts from vents hotter than boiling in eruptions of mineral-rich fluid. At these hydrothermal vents, life does not depend on sunlight but on chemoautotrophic bacteria that feast on sulfur and other chemicals. Entire ecosystems orbit these bacteria, forming towering chimneys and swaying fields of tubeworms that rival forests in biomass and mystery. The tubeworms lack mouths and stomachs, hosting within their bodies the bacteria that convert vent chemicals into nourishment. Their red plumes filter the mineral-laden water like gills written by alchemy. Around them, crabs, shrimp, and clams parade through clouds of warmth, each species adapted to survive in a place where heat and poison coexist in practical harmony. Pitted into the ocean floor are trenches that feel like the planet's scars, sutures that plunge deeper than any mountain is tall. The Mariana Trench, the deepest known cleft, reaches into a pressure so intense metal collapses and any human breath would be turned liquid by force. Yet life persists even on those abyssal slopes, in forms that read like whispers, slow, small, patient communities eking out existence in a realm that never sees a sunbeam. The deep is an archive of time. Creatures there preserve ancient lineages, living fossils whose forms change at geological rhythms. The vampire squid, the coelacanth, and other oddities are reminders that evolution sometimes keeps a design because it works, because in the cold, the stable, the predictable, there is no premium on novelty. Sound guides movement where sight fails. Whales dive and sing low into the abyss, using sound to map and express, blue giants tracing pathways through pressure and dark. Some calls travel for hundreds of miles, bending through water layers like a migrating current of feeling, carrying information across borders we recognize only as waves of frequency and rhythm. The deep is not passive, it breathes and pulses with currents that move like slow rivers. Thermohaline circulation, driven by temperature and salt, stirs the global oceans and, with them, climate. A change in a far-off current down there can nudge weather systems in ways we feel on the surface as storms, droughts, or soft rain. Many species have taken the route of stealth, evolving transparent bodies to vanish in the dim light and become a ghost against a ghostly backdrop. Others wear armor or glowing eyes, or develop tentacles that unfurl like question marks to catch whatever curiosity drifts by. Each choice is a solution to scarcity and danger, a tiny decision tested by time and the blunt instrument of death. We have learned much by listening to the sea with instruments that mimic ears and eyes. Sonar picks up the bustle of whale song and the slow scrape of tectonic plates. Submersibles photograph creatures that no one had thought possible. ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, dangle like tiny observatories, their lamps creating temporary day for species accustomed only to night. Yet our knowledge is patchwork, a map of islands connected by threads of data. Most of the ocean remains uncharted, an underworld of statistics and silence. Even the regions we've sampled reveal surprises that rearrange assumptions, new species, unexpected behaviors, collaborations between life forms that read like partnerships in a subterranean fable. Consider the vampire flatworm that farms bacteria on its surface, grooming them like livestock and using them for food. Or the shrimp that build feeding platforms on sulfide chimneys, engineering habitats with a patience that rivals coral architects. These are not solitary lives, they are ecosystems as social and as intricate as any forest we walk through on land. The ocean floor is littered with the detritus of a million lives, rain of organic fallout from the productive upper layers, the slow drift of dead plankton and fecal pellets that become food for those below. This marine snow feeds a community of scavengers, sea cucumbers, brittle stars, and worms, animals that convert what falls into a living landscape. Their work is the quiet economy of the abyss, recycling and renewing the palette of life. Every so often a whale dies and tumbles down, and the resulting carcass becomes a cathedral of decomposers. These whale falls anchor entire timelines of life, fast-feeding amphipods strip flesh in months, while in the decades that follow chemoautotrophic bacteria and specialist worms host communities that live on the bones and oils. A single whale can seed an entire chain of life long after its last breath. Pressure shapes physiology. Cell membranes, enzymes, and skeletons become different under weight that would flatten a car into a sheet. Deep-sea fish often lack the swim bladders of their shallow cousins, or they have lipid-rich tissues that replace gas pockets, allowing them to float where rising would be fatal. Eyes become layered or giant, or vanish entirely, replaced by other senses tuned to electrical fields, vibrations, or faint chemical traces. Chemistry in the abyss is a language written in minerals and metal. Manganese nodules stud the seafloor like moans of rust, collecting slowly over millions of years. They contain valuable metals and draw commercial interest, but with the promise of extraction comes the threat of destroying ecosystems that grow around them, fragile and slow to recover. The intersection of human industry and the deep is recent and consequential. Fishing fleets beam lights into black water and trawl the seafloor, dragging with them nets that uproot life as if plowing a grave. Plastic descends too, a slow rain of implacable waste, and microplastics infiltrate the food web, moving from bacteria to fish to the whales we revere, and sometimes back to us through the fish we eat. Noise is a pollutant in the deep as well, an invisible pressure that interrupts whale song and seafloor communication. Seismic surveys, ship engines, and industrial activity create a continuous roar that can stress marine life, displacing animals and masking calls that are essential for mating and navigation. The sea, once a realm of natural acoustics, begins to resemble a city with honking cars and unfinished construction sites. Despite our intrusions, the deep remains a teacher. Each expedition teaches humility and a new sense of scale. Submersibles descended by titans of engineering carry scientists who peer through reinforced portals at creatures that seem to have stepped out of primeval fables. Cameras record behaviors that rewrite textbooks, cooperative hunting, tool use, and parental strategies as diverse as anything seen on land. Exploration has always been entwined with myth. Sailors told tales of leviathans and sea gods, of whirlpools that drag ships to Hades. Those stories are not merely superstition, they are cultural translations of encounters with the unknown. Modern science faces the same unknown with instruments and hypotheses, but also with the same hunger for narrative that shaped ancient tales. Deep-sea vents were once imagined as rare curiosities. Now we know they are abundant across mid-ocean ridges and even on continental margins. Each vent field is a local miracle. Minerals precipitate into chimneys, bacteria colonize and convert chemicals into biomass, and communities assemble often in predictable patterns. But predictability ends when you look closer. Local adaptations make every site unique. In some places, life binds with geology so tightly that organisms control mineral deposition. Microbial mats can mediate the formation of minerals, building structures that geologists later misinterpret as purely abiotic formations. The line between living and non-living blurs at these junctions, reminding us that life can be both sculptor and clay. There are apex predators here too, though they differ from the terrestrial image of wolves and lions. Giant squids, elusive and seldom seen, haunt the deep with eyes the size of dinner plates, built to capture what little light filters down. They battle sperm whales in an ancient duel of force and will, and sometimes giant beaks leave scars on whale tissue that are recorded and retold across generations of researchers. Sperm whales dive deep to hunt, their echolocation clicks probing the dark like sonar pings. They may descend for an hour at a time, following a map of scent, sound, and memory to a hunting ground invisible to us. These dives reshape the surface world as well, because the whales carry nutrients between depths through their feces, linking the abyss to the skin of the ocean. Life in the abyss operates on different temporal rhythms. Growth slows, metabolism conserves, encounters are rare and must be taken when they come. Some species lay few, enormous eggs that develop slowly, while others spawn prodigiously when conditions allow. Reproductive strategies are poems written for a place where opportunity is scarce and the cost of failure is final. Some organisms glow not only to catch prey but to communicate in complex social rituals. The ostracod, a tiny crustacean, uses timed light displays to attract mates in synchronized flares that can outshine the darkness. These displays are a kind of dance, a coordinated pattern that requires both individual signal and collective timing, like a chorus in a darkened theater. Symbiosis is a recurring theme in these depths. Giant mussels and tubeworms cultivate bacterial gardens. Certain crabs carry snippets of bacteria on their gills. Microbes inhabit the tissues of animals, altering metabolism and enabling survival in poisoned waters. This mutual dependence shows that life can cooperate as much as it competes, and sometimes the line between host and symbiont is as thin as a membrane. The abyss is also a museum of extreme physiology. Some bacteria thrive at temperatures above what human proteins could survive. Others oxidize hydrogen or sulfur, creating energy from chemical gradients rather than sunlight. These metabolisms expand our idea of what is possible, informing where life might persist on other worlds, beneath the ice of Jupiter's moon Europa, or in the brines of distant moons. Indeed, the study of the deep has become a guide in astrobiology. When we imagine life on icy moons, we envision hydrothermal vents beneath subsurface oceans, mineral chemistry feeding microbial clouds in the dark. The possibility that life could exist in such alien places is no longer mere speculation, it is a hypothesis reinforced by ecosystems we've already observed here on Earth. Explorers of the abyss must also be artists of patience. Capturing a feeding event or an interaction takes hours of quiet monitoring, adjusting lights and cameras to avoid startling the subjects. Sometimes the most profound discoveries are made by accident, a lens catching the flutter of a previously unknown fin, or a sample revealing an organism that defies classification. Classification itself is a moving target. As molecular tools improve, species once thought related are reassembled into new families, and entire branches of the tree of life are redrawn. Genetic sequences whisper histories of migration and adaptation, revealing lineages that were separated by millions of years and brought together in the cold womb of the ocean floor. There is elegance in how life solves familiar problems. Eyes evolve to capture the faintest glint, mouths reshape to siphon the smallest morsel, and limbs become sponges, anchors, or delicate nets. Form follows function in the deep with a clarity that reads like engineering solved by evolution over eons. But the deep sea is also a place of paradox. Abundance and scarcity coexist in the same breath. A vent field may support dense animal life in its immediate shadow while the surrounding plain remains sparsely populated. Predation is constant, yet so is cooperation. Isolation breeds specialization, and generalists find niches everywhere. These contradictions are not mistakes but the texture of adaptation. Our instruments sometimes act like intrusive guests. Lights on ROVs can blind or attract fauna, the sound of thrusters can spook animals, and the very act of sampling disturbs delicate structures. Scientists are learning to tread more lightly, developing quieter vehicles, dimmer lights, and sampling strategies that minimize impact, but knowledge often demands a cost. There is an ethical question stitched into every mission. When we learn, what responsibility do we bear? Discovering a new species is almost inevitably the prelude to categorizing it, studying it, and sometimes exploiting it. The deep has resources, biomolecules, genes, minerals, that promise medical breakthroughs and industrial uses, but harvesting them could strip the sea of wonders before we understand them. Bioprospecting is an ongoing conversation between science and commerce. Molecules from deep-sea organisms have yielded enzymes that work at high pressure and temperature, with potential applications in industry and medicine. Yet each extraction carries the risk of disrupting fragile, slowly formed communities that might never recover from human interference. The law moves slower than curiosity. International waters are governed by treaties and negotiations that struggle to balance exploitation and conservation. The concept of marine protected areas extends into the deep with great difficulty, enforcing restrictions where no one sees for months at a time tests both diplomacy and technology. Climate change adds a new layer of complexity. As surface waters warm and acidity increases, the chemistry that reaches the deep changes, altering the food inputs and survival strategies of abyssal communities. Ocean acidification dissolves calcium carbonate structures, threatening animals that build shells or skeletons, and shifts in productivity modify the slow rain of organic matter that feeds the deep. There is a cultural hunger for the unknown that the deep satisfies. Books and films draw on its imagery of monstrous carp and luminous gardens, but the real stories are often subtler, truer, and more moving. They are tales of cooperation under pressure, of inventions shaped by extreme constraints, and of quiet persistence against the odds. Technology continues to evolve as if in conversation with the deep. Autonomous vehicles cruise for weeks, mapping seafloor topography with lasers, while swarms of sensors collect continuous data on temperature, chemistry, and movement. These instruments deliver not just facts but the rhythms of the ocean, revealing seasonal cycles and sudden anomalies that suggest unseen events. Sometimes the abyss speaks through sudden, dramatic gestures, Undersea volcanic eruptions reshape the seafloor in moments, displacing communities and creating new substrates for colonization. Landslides on submarine slopes can trigger tsunamis, linking geological shifts to surface calamities. These events remind us that the deep is dynamic, not merely dark and still. Human stories are woven into deep-sea narratives too. Fishermen recount encounters with strange nets of bioluminescent jelly that glow when hauled up, their crew awed into silence by the pulsing lights. Submersible pilots speak of the first time they saw an alien landscape, a surreal moment when the familiar world of surface living vanishes and is replaced by textures and movements that belong to an older Earth. The deep has inspired myths and rituals. Indigenous communities who live by the sea tell stories of spirits that dwell beneath waves, of offerings to keep balance, and of relationships to marine creatures that are part practical stewardship and part sacred respect. Those traditions sometimes carry ecological wisdom born of centuries of observation and restraint. Conservation must therefore be part science and part humility. Protecting the deep requires more than mapping and legislation. It asks for a change in how we value unseen ecosystems. We must weigh the short-term gain from extracting resources against the long-term loss of functions and species we barely know and may never understand until they are gone. Education is the bridge between wonder and stewardship. When people hear the sounds of whale song translated into an audible experience or watch footage of a vent field alive with tubeworms, curiosity grows into care. Stories move people. They are the currency of empathy and the means by which distant phenomena become intimate realities in our minds. There is beauty in the way research reframes fear. Where sailors once feared whirlpools and monsters, today researchers recognize patterns and create models. That understanding does not eliminate mystery, rather, it sharpens it, replacing superstition with a more complex appreciation of processes and relationships. As we learn, we also invent new metaphors for the deep. We speak of gardens on the seafloor, of cities of light, of hidden economies of detritus and decay. These metaphors help us hold the abyss in our imagination, making it more accessible without flattening its strangeness into cliché. Even now, in the quiet of a late-night drive, the sea continues its work of shaping life. Currents move like patient brushes painting in broad strokes. Microbes process chemicals and microcosms that will affect the air you breathe. The planet is a single, connected organism, and the abyss is a vital organ in that larger body. Researchers make slow progress by building networks of observations over time. Long-term observatories anchored to the seafloor record changes in oxygen, temperature, and life cycles, producing data that reveal trends only visible across decades. With enough continuity, patterns emerge: population cycles, responses to climate anomalies, and the slow march of recovery after disturbance. Citizen science is expanding the chorus of listeners. Recreational divers, fishermen, and coastal communities contribute observations that feed into larger datasets, building a mosaic of human experience with the ocean. This democratization of discovery widens both the talent and the compassion directed toward the abyss. The deep triggers philosophical questions. What does it mean that life thrives in places we cannot see or easily reach? How does knowing the complexity of the abyss affect our sense of place on Earth? These questions do not have neat answers, but they invite reflection, a slow turning of thought that mirrors the slow rhythms of the deep itself. Every new mission yields surprises that seem to ask for a vision of how we think. The discovery of microbial life in hydrothermal plumes propelled reconsideration of nutrient cycles. The finding of vast microbial communities under Antarctic ice beds expanded our notion of habitable environments. Each surprise is a door opening to more questions. Some stories from the deep read like detective novels. Scientists trace a decline in a species to a subtle change in nutrient flow that began with human activity miles away. Solving the case requires the accumulation of evidence, chemical signatures, genetic markers, and ancient sediment records that piece together events across time and space. Sediment cores from the seafloor are time capsules. Layers accumulate slowly, preserving pollen, ash, and chemical imprints that tell of past climates and ancient blooms. These cores show that the ocean has moved through warm and cold phases, carrying with it the fates of species and the footprint of human intervention. Deep-sea research also reveals the adaptability of life in surprising ways. Some organisms can tolerate fluctuations in oxygen that would kill others, entering low-energy states until conditions improve. This resilience gives hope but is not a guarantee. Adaptability has limits when changes are too rapid or pervasive. The interplay of isolation and connectivity is central to deep-sea ecology. While hydrothermal vents can be isolated islands of life, currents sometimes link them, allowing larvae to drift from one field to another. This balance of disconnection and unexpected connectivity shapes genetic diversity and the potential for recolonization after disturbance. Scientists use diverse tools to study these links: genetic barcoding to track population relationships, tagging to follow migrations, and acoustic mapping to identify corridors. Each technique adds a texture to the story, turning isolated observations into narratives about movement, adaptation, and the history of life in the dark. There is an almost poetic economy in deep-sea food webs. Energy is precious, and every transfer matters. Predators often conserve energy with slow ambush tactics or sit-and-wait strategies, while prey develop misdirection, camouflage, or chemical defenses that are equal parts art and survival. Chemical gradients sculpt communities in the deep as surely as light and temperature do at the surface. Tiny variations in pH, sulfide concentration, or metal availability can determine which microbes dominate and which animals thrive. These chemical contours paint a map of opportunity that life reads with molecular receptors and behavioral algorithms honed by eons. The deep also teaches us about scale, both temporal and spatial. A microbial mat can change year by year, while nodule growth accumulates over millennia. Understanding these divergent timescales forces us to reconsider our expectations. What is a quick recovery in human terms may be an eternity in the abyss. Language often falls short when describing the deep. Words like alien or monstrous capture wonder but risk othering the life that is part of our own biosphere. Better metaphors frame the abyss as a cousin of the surface world, less distant than we imagine and intimately linked through nutrients, currents, and shared evolutionary history. There are practical reasons to care for the deep. The ocean stores carbon, regulates climate, and supports fisheries upon which millions depend. The abyss plays a quiet, often unseen role in these functions, sequestering carbon in sediments and processing organic matter that would otherwise circulate through the atmosphere. Innovations in policy and technology can help mitigate damage while expanding knowledge. International cooperation on protected areas, industry standards for reduced impact, and investments in low-disturbance exploration can preserve the most sensitive habitats. Open data sharing among nations and institutions accelerates understanding and creates a guardrail against exploitative secrecy. But policy needs public will, and public will need stories. Narratives that connect people to the deep, through art, film, and compelling science communication, foster the emotional resonance necessary for lasting change. When people feel implicated in a story, they are likelier to act. The deep asks us to feel before we legislate. There is a human tenderness in how researchers speak of their finds. A scientist can become familiarly poetic about the curvature of a tentacle or the color of an internal organ illuminated by submersible lights. These intimate descriptions translate data into something that touches the heart. Numbers become lives and specimens become neighbors. The future of deep-sea exploration will likely be collaborative and incremental, blending machine endurance with human intuition. Autonomous systems will map and monitor constantly, while human visits will be rare, ceremonial events that combine careful observation with the capacity for in-the-moment judgment. This partnership echoes the relationship between scout and archivist. Machines gather, humans interpret, and together they weave knowledge. The next age of exploration is already here. Subscribe and share in the comments what you believe matters more: perfect data from machines or the human instinct that sees beyond numbers. There is a danger in thinking of the deep as only a place of resources to be mined or lives to be cataloged. It is a fundamental component of Earth's biosphere, a place where chemistry and life meet and craft systems that support the planet. Our decisions in the coming decades will reverberate through those systems, affecting not just unseen species but the climate, fisheries, and ecosystems we rely on. Hope emerges in the form of curiosity and restraint combined. Advances in non-invasive technology, rising environmental awareness, and international frameworks for protection suggest that stewardship is possible. The abyss demands patient guardianship, not frantic plunder, and in that demand there is an invitation to act wisely. The sea whispers and will continue to whisper, whether we listen or not. Those whispers carry clues about the planet's past, present, and future. If we attune ourselves to their cadence, we may learn not only how the deep lives but how we, on the surface, fit into a larger pattern of life that survives by cooperation, persistence, and subtle adaptation. There is a moral economy to deep-sea stewardship, the knowledge that some values cannot be measured in immediate profit. Preserving a vent field or a coral cold seep is an investment in the future, an acknowledgement that some marvels deserve longevity beyond a single generation's use. That idea of legacy can change how we extract, study, and relate to the ocean. As instruments listen and cameras watch, the deep will keep revealing paradox and beauty. The more we know, the more complex the picture becomes, and the more careful we must be in our judgment. Discovery brings responsibility. Knowledge is a lantern that both illuminates and shadows new obligations. To imagine a dive into the abyss is to enter a world without horizons. The mind stretches to accommodate alien anatomies and slow ecologies, and in that stretch something softens in us, a recognition of humility and awe. We are not masters of this world. We are students and occasional stewards, invited to respect what we cannot wholly command. The deep sea stories are long and patient, woven over timescales that mock our impatience. They teach us that survival is not only about strength but about timing, cooperation, and the skill of being small in a large system. If we listen long enough, the whispers in the abyss may teach us something about living on the surface too. In the distance of mapped soundscapes and measured currents, there are still secrets that defy immediate explanation. Strange calls, unexpected blooms, and organisms without known relatives remind us that the catalog is incomplete and that the unknown presses in from all sides. This incompleteness is not a deficit but an invitation to keep asking, to keep refining tools, and to keep imagining possibilities beyond our current models. The deepest points of the ocean are like deep wells of history. Sediments preserve the echo of meteor impacts, ancient climate shifts, and the slow fall of organisms. By reading these layers, scientists reconstruct epochs of change and survival. The ocean becomes an archive that chronicles both Earth's transformations and the slow resilience of life. There are practical ways forward that can scale with humility. Designating key vent fields and seamounts as protected areas, limiting bottom trawling, and regulating deep-sea mining with stringent environmental safeguards are steps that balance need and preservation. Combined with robust monitoring, these measures can reduce the risk of irreversible damage. Some scientists hope to create living seed banks for the deep, preserving microbial strains and genetic material that could help regenerate ecosystems if damage occurs. Such biobanks raise ethical questions about ownership and access, but they also offer a hedge against losses we cannot yet predict. Preservation here is as much about information as it is about living tissue. The deep's mysteries are also stories of relationship between predator and prey, host and symbiont, vent and community, human and sea. Each relationship holds lessons about balance and the consequences of upset. When one thread is severed, the effects often ripple in ways that are difficult to foresee. When you return your attention to the road or the task at hand, remember that beneath your feet, at the edge of perception, a world is humming with life. That world participates in cycles that touch your life in subtle but important ways: the air you breathe, the climate you inhabit, the fish on your plate. The deep is not remote. It is a hidden partner in the planetary system. Listening to the deep is an act of care. It requires instruments, yes, but also imagination and a willingness to be affected. The stories that come back are both science and song, data wrapped in feeling, evidence filtered through curiosity and compassion. The abyss demands that we respect the slow. Quick fixes and immediate returns are the enemies of ecosystems that build and recover over centuries. Patience may be the most radical policy in deep-sea stewardship. It asks us to put value on futures we do not personally inhabit. There will be new stories, undoubtedly. As technologies improve, we will penetrate darker corners and find organisms that rewrite the rules yet again. Each discovery will be a teaching moment, and each teaching moment will carry a choice about how to apply that knowledge, whether to conserve, to exploit, or to simply marvel. In the end, the whispers in the abyss are a kind of mirror. They show us how life persists under limits we might think intolerable, and they reflect back questions about our own capacity for adaptation and restraint. The deeper we go into their stories, the more careful we become in our actions on the surface. Let these reflections linger the next time the road hums beneath your wheels or you stand looking at the sea. The abyss is patient. It will keep its secrets for some time, but it is not inexhaustible. How we choose to listen, to learn, and to act will determine whether the whisper becomes a chorus of thriving life or a quiet of loss. So keep listening, keep asking, and carry the image of that dark, luminous world with you. It is part of the same living earth that holds you now, fragile, intricate, and full of stories that get better the longer you hear them. The abyss speaks in whispers, but its message echoes across the planet, waiting for us to answer in kind. The sea has always spoken in a language of motion and shadow, and if you listen with patience you will hear the faint echo of cities submerged beneath its surface. Imagine streets worn smooth by centuries of salt and tide, columns reclining like sleeping trees, and lanterns of coral lighting corridors where people once passed. It is a slow, liquid remembering, and it carries tales of empires that rose from dust and sank into the soft, forgiving dark. Where legends begin, maps end, and beneath that end lies a geography of wonder. The ocean keeps its own cartography, sketched in currents and the drift of silt, concealing things that should not be lost. Divers and dreamers alike have chased those maps, tracing seams of light that suggest walls and roofs, and each discovery reframes what we think we know about the past. If you close your eyes, you can imagine approaching a submerged gate, the hinges colonized by barnacles and the metal softened into the shape of time. There is a hush there that is unlike any darkness on land, a stillness that holds memories like pearls. When you pass beyond that threshold, the mundane world recedes and you enter a realm where stories continue to breathe, preserved in salt and silence. These lost worlds are not merely ruins, they are palimpsests, layers of habitation and deity, language and ritual pressed over one another by the slow hand of ages. Stones bear the fingerprints of hands long gone, inscriptions have scarred themselves into surfaces and then been smoothed over by sand, and statues sit half-swallowed like sentinels lulled into oblivion. The deeper you go, the less the sea imposes its anonymity, and the more the human mark asserts itself through stubborn fragments. It is tempting to think of a single great cataclysm that toppled everything, an event of such cinematic force that it becomes the story we tell. But the truth is braided and patient: rising seas, earthquakes that rearranged the map, gradual economic decline, invasions, and weather that grew meaner with time. Often the fall was a series of small defeats rather than one grand collapse, a culture slipping inch by inch until its foundations were nothing but memory. Listen for the voices the sea preserves, thin as a shell held to the ear, and you will find hymns and curses weaving together. In some submerged temples, inscriptions still resonate with the cadence of prayer, lines calling on gods whose faces have been blurred by algae and growth. Those gods are not merely sculptures, they are centers of meaning that once organized the world for people who trusted them with harvests and storms and the passage of ships. When scholars first began to examine sunken sites, they wore the confidence of a mapmaker tracing familiar borders. They expected to find versions of their own histories underwater, palaces like those on land, coinage, bureaucratic records. Instead, they encountered hybrid forms, architectural experiments born of maritime life, administrative choices shaped by tides and trade, and symbols that refused to fit comfortably into pre-existing categories. Trade is a key that often unlocks the story of a submerged civilization, because the sea is both barrier and highway, generous and cruel. Merchant vessels, their hulls laden with pottery, spices, metals, and carved ivory, stitched distant peoples together, and sometimes those ships never returned to the safety of harbor. Wrecks accumulate like confessions, and their contents tell us not only what people ate or wore, but who they trusted and what they feared. Take the ceramics you might find scattered across an ancient quay. Some bear the smoky glaze of one culture, others the patterned clay of another, and their mixture speaks of exchange and curiosity. Those pots are like letters written in clay, each choosing a place in a marketplace and leaving its mark on the collective appetite. They reveal bridges that existed between worlds now separated by fathoms of water. Coins, when they survive the salt and pressure, are small, blunt testimonies to political life and economy. Their faces depict rulers who once ordered taxes and arranged marriages, and their edges tell of routes by which wealth traveled. A coin found among coral incrustation can reframe the timeline of a city, suggesting connections to distant courts and revealing the influence of trade winds and sailors who preferred certain currents. But not all traces are municipal. Personal items, fairly ordinary things like combs, amulets, and children's toys, escape the grand narratives and bring us close to individual lives. A carved bone hairpin, its surface polished by fingers long vanished, hints at the fashions and private rituals of a woman who once sat by a hearth. These objects humanize the ruins, reminding us that cities are collections of people rather than mere civic plans. Burials offer a different kind of intimacy, and yet they are also subject to the sea's reordering. Some tombs resist erosion, others surrender their contents to storms. Graves can reveal beliefs about the afterlife, the relative wealth of individuals, and the ways communities attempted to keep memory alive. Funerary goods, boats buried with the dead, and the orientation of skeletons speak of customs that may appear exotic at first and then beautifully ordinary upon closer listening. The architecture of sunken cities is where the imagination is most readily fed, because water bestows a painterly quality on human frames. Columns become reeds, staircases look like the spines of sleeping beasts, and plazas are paved with the soft light of filtered sun. You can almost hear the original clatter of feet, replaced now by the sound of fish weaving through open windows and the creak of seed plants in the current. Some submerged sites display a surprising sophistication in engineering, with drainage systems adapted to keep water away and layered foundations that reveal a practical mastery of local challenges. These technological solutions were not solely utilitarian, they were statements about what a community valued and how it controlled its environment. And those solutions are stories of experimentation, failure, and eventual refinement, and a sense of humility before the forces of water. Religious life in these cities often combined local spirit worship with imported pantheons, creating syncretic practices that blurred boundaries. A deity might begin as a personified current or a protector of a particular harbor and later assume the attributes of a foreign sea god brought by traders. Worship thus becomes a language of negotiation, with shrines and offerings serving as a compact between people and the unpredictable ocean. Offerings themselves are fascinating, sometimes practical, sometimes symbolic. They reveal what mattered to people in moments of supplication. Textiles do not survive well underwater, but metal amulets and carved stone tokens do, and their motifs range from the abstract to the vividly literal. An offering could be a ship model left to calm a storm, a bowl cast into tide as plea for fertility, or a coin slipped into the mouth of a statue, each action defining a relationship with the divine. And then there are the gods who seem to forget and be forgotten in turn, sleeping beneath silt until something disturbs their repose. Revival can happen in quiet ways, a reef forming over a statue's lap, creating a halo of life that draws divers and scholars. Sometimes reclamation is violent, when storms uproot sand and reveal fragments that reawaken curiosity, leading to the slow work of translation and interpretation. The act of rediscovery is always as much about the present as it is about the past. When contemporary eyes fall upon a submerged relief, they do not merely reconstruct a historic scene, they bring modern concerns and questions, casting new shadows on old imagery. Archaeologists are interpreters and narrators as well as excavators, and their own stories shape how the past is told and retold. There is a delicate ethics to this work, because the sea can be both a protector and a tomb, and the excavation of a site can expose it to new dangers. Air brought into a previously sealed environment changes chemistry, microbes flourish under new conditions, and exposed materials can quickly deteriorate. Conservators work to stabilize artifacts, but each intervention is a weighing of benefits and risks, a judgment on how to honor what remains. Human hands do not only disturb, they also care for and attempt to restore. Restoration can be small and tender, like imbuing a fragment with a label that gives it a name and thus a place within a story. It can be grand as well, attempting to reconstruct facades and halls to offer the modern world a sense of what once stood proud above the waves. Those reconstructions invite contemplation and also debate, for they are interpretations, not simple returns. Stories persist in their ability to reshape our understanding, especially when myth and history intersect. Think of legends that speak of golden cities swallowed by the sea, and imagine how much of such stories is memory and how much is warning. Myths often encode simple truths. A people who lived dangerously close to a shifting coast might tell stories that remind future generations to respect both abundance and risk. The sea tends to personify calamity in its tales, and so we meet figures of hubris who attempt to command tides and are punished by them. Those narratives serve social functions, cautioning against greed or arrogance, but they also preserve kernels of real events, like a gradual encroachment of the waterline that forced communities to relocate. Legends are therefore fragments of empirical wisdom wrapped in narrative form. When entire belief systems sink, the gods they worship do not vanish so much as change posture, their cults migrate, adapt, or are subsumed by other faiths. A temple submerged off one coast may re-emerge in a different guise in the oral traditions of an island far away, its deity remembered as a stormbringer or a protector of fishermen. Religious continuity can surprise us with its elasticity and capacity for survival under new names and forms. Some gods are stubborn in their silence, becoming something like fossils of devotion. Their carved faces, when uncovered, are like ancient photographs that resist the tendency to be immediately relatable. We study them as symbols, trying to understand what attributes were important to people whose worldview included these beings, and in that studying we both honor and distance ourselves from the original devotees. Language, too, changes in submerged settlements, and inscriptions can be stubbornly cryptic, written in scripts that fade into unfamiliarity. Decipherment is a slow work of puzzle and intuition, combining pattern recognition with the patient cross-referencing of material culture. Each translation unlocks a voice, sometimes mundane and sometimes lyrical, revealing the banality and the poetry of daily life. Inscriptions sometimes reveal administrative concerns, tallies of grain, directives for maritime taxes, lists of names that bring a day-to-day reality to the gilded ruin. Other times they are deeply personal, dedications to lost husbands, curses muttered at thieves, poems to the sea. Those writings make the submerged city feel less like an abstraction and more like a sequence of ordinary mournings and funerals and market exchanges. Music likely filled these spaces when they were whole, the sound of wind through open colonnades, drums marking ritual time, and voices layered in harmony. Underwater, we can only infer musical life from instruments that survive or from iconography carved into stone. But we can imagine sounds muffled by salt spray, the rhythm of waves informing dance, and the cadence of sailors' songs blending with temple hymns. Artistic expression in submerged cities can be incredibly inventive, responding to the peculiarities of marine trade and coastal survival. Mosaics survive best in protected spaces, where tiny stones maintain their pattern against the slow assault of algae. When mosaics do surface, their scenes of maritime life, gods, heroes, and daily commerce create a visual dialogue between sea and city, a conversation as old as the first hole that cut water. Statues are perhaps the most haunting survivors, faces arrested in permanence and then softened by living things that grow upon them. Barnacles become eyelashes, seaweed a crown, and the statues acquire a new dignity as ecosystems. That accretion changes how we look at them. What once was an emblem of dominance becomes a collaborative work between human art and marine life. Consider also the effect of light in these submerged spaces, which bends and filters into a chiaroscuro much softer than daylight. Sunlight, when it penetrates, paints moving patterns across floors and hieroglyphs, animating them in slow, flickering sequences. At depth, bioluminescence sometimes takes over, with creatures that glow like candle flames along recesses, giving these ruins an eerie, otherworldly theater. The interplay between sea life and architecture is not merely aesthetic, it is ecological. Ruins provide substrate for coral and algae, become nurseries for juvenile fish, and create pockets of biodiversity where open sand once lay. In time, what started as abandonment turns into a new kind of habitation, a gentle repurposing where human-made form supports new life in the ocean's cycles. Stories of submerged civilizations also challenge how we define progress. We often assume that societies on land progressed in a linear fashion toward what we now call modernity, but the record underwater disrupts that narrative. Some coastal cultures developed highly specialized marine technologies and art forms, and their innovations were suitable to their circumstances even if those approaches look different from urban, inland models of advancement. When we find objects from multiple cultures in the same submerged site, we are witnessing a cosmopolitan past, where borders were porous and identity was mutable. People married across language lines, merchants adopted foreign customs, and local gods accepted foreign rituals. Such mixing complicates modern ideas of purity, reminding us that human history is a tapestry of interleaving threads. The sea also acts as a repository for the unexpected, preserving items that historians did not anticipate. Organic materials that survive in low oxygen conditions, like ropes and wooden hull fragments, provide invaluable insights into shipbuilding and daily use. These finds expand our understanding not only of economics and art, but also of technology and material culture in practical, grounded ways. Shipwrecks, more than any other category of find, dramatize the fragility of human enterprise at sea. One moment a vessel is poised to cross the horizon, its crew singing and its timbers flexing, and the next it is at rest on the seafloor, its cargo strewn like a scatter of testimony. Wreck sites become three-dimensional time capsules where spatial relationships tell of loading patterns, haste, even panic. The narratives that arise from these remains are often complicated by the interposition of salvage and looting over the centuries. Some wrecks were plundered soon after sinking, others lay untouched for millennia. The ethics of salvage, balancing the recovery of goods with conservation and scholarship, remain fraught, as competing interests ask who owns the past and how it should be used. Beyond artifacts, environmental data gleaned from sediment and shells reconstruct ancient climates and sea levels, offering context for human choices. By studying layers of silt and the chemistry bound within shells, scientists can infer droughts, floods, and the steady rise of sea that may have pressured communities into migration or innovation. This environmental narrative is essential to understanding how and why populations relocated or restructured their economies. Yet the story of a submerged civilization is not merely a climate story. Human agency, culture, and decision-making matter profoundly. Communities adapted in myriad ways, through engineering, through ritual, through new forms of governance, and those adaptations deserve attention. To ascribe every fall to an indifferent planet is to simplify complex human histories. The emotional dimension of these sites is also powerful. There is a melancholic elegance in ruins that suggests both loss and continuity. Descendants of submerged communities sometimes retain stories that echo real events, and those oral traditions can guide archaeologists to sites otherwise invisible. Memory lives in many forms, and people have long ways of remembering that do not require archives. Consider the role of performance and narrative in keeping a submerged past alive. Festivals reimagine lost harbors, songs retell shipwrecks, and culinary traditions preserve tastes of traded spices. Cultural practices carry a form of resistance against disappearance. They transplant meaning from vanished contexts into living celebrations. This cultural resilience often surprises researchers who approach the past expecting only silence. Technology has altered our capacity to explore the deep, with remotely operated vehicles and sophisticated sonar mapping revealing topographies previously imagined only in rumor. These tools have their own logic and limitations, presenting pictures that must be interpreted cautiously. A sonar map might suggest a square shape and seduce the eye into seeing a building where none exists, reminding us of the need for patient, corroborative fieldwork. When excavation does take place, it is performed with a kind of reverence, as if the act of lifting an object into daylight is also an act of reclamation. Conservators often tag and catalog each fragment, attempting to reconstruct not only form but context, because the position of an object in the sediment is as meaningful as the object itself. That context allows stories to be told in something more than speculative brushstrokes. Excavations are collaborative endeavors, involving not only scientists but also local communities whose lives intersect with the submerged sites. Those communities bring essential knowledge, old charts, place names, and oral histories that no technical survey could replicate. The most ethical projects are those that involve local people as partners, acknowledging their custodianship of the past. The sea below sometimes reveals surprises that change long-held chronologies, such as evidence of pre-existing harbor systems or maritime practices we had not imagined. These discoveries force historians to update frameworks and rethink the pace of technological innovation. Each new datum acts like a small lever, shifting the weight of historical narratives toward a fuller, more nuanced understanding. There are also darker stories, places where the sea became a silent theater of violence, where fleets were decimated in battle, or where maritime trade funded cruel practices like slavery and exploitation. Wrecks can be sites of tragedy as well as marvels, and human stories of suffering are embedded in those timbers and chains. A balanced account must acknowledge both awe and atrocity, for both are part of the human past. Museums display many recovered objects behind glass, and there they become points of contact between publics and submerged pasts. Curators assemble narratives that are choices in themselves, selecting which stories to hear and which to emphasize. Exhibits can humanize and educate, but they can also simplify, so attentive curation matters for keeping the nuance of discovery intact. The metaphor of depth extends to time as well. What is submerged is distant and near simultaneously, because underwater sites are often close to modern shores yet belong to distant epochs. That proximity produces a kind of uncanny familiarity. A map of the coastline suddenly looks different when the sea reveals a forgotten inlet or the foundation of a wharf. Those changes remind us that geography is not fixed and that human constructions are more temporary than we often assume. The economic stakes of submerged heritage are also real. Tourism can bring funds and attention to preservation, but it can also commodify and degrade fragile sites. Sustainable management balances the desire to share with the imperative to protect. Engaging tourists in education rather than spectacle can create allies for conservation who return home with a deeper appreciation for stewardship. Climate change complicates the equation further, since rising seas threaten both submerged sites and living communities. Ironically, as sea levels rise, some sites become more accessible for excavation while others are lost beyond recovery. The urgency to document and conserve grows, but so does the challenge, for preservation requires resources that are often in short supply. The notion of lost worlds below is also a mirror reflecting our cultural anxieties about memory and oblivion. We are drawn to ruins because they suggest that not everything vanishes quietly. Some things leave material traces that insist upon being known again. That impulse fuels interdisciplinary collaboration, drawing archaeologists, historians, marine scientists, artists, and local custodians together in a common endeavor. Artists respond to these submerged worlds in ways that think beyond archaeology, translating fragments into immersive experiences that invite empathy rather than mere curiosity. Installations mimic the quivering light of the sea or reinterpret marine growth as a living tapestry on human forms. Art allows us to feel residue of the past in our own bodies, to internalize rather than merely observe ancient lives. Literature, too, has long found sustenance in drowned cities, from poems that imagine lovers lingering in submerged houses to novels that reconstruct the last hours of a harbor town. Such fictional treatments can illuminate emotional truth even when they do not strictly adhere to data, because they tap the imagination that connects us across centuries. Stories make archaeology legible at the level of feeling. Even the language we use, words like ancient, lost, and ruin, shapes how we approach these sites, and revisiting that vocabulary helps us escape romanticization. Lost implies absence, yet a nearer truth is one of transformation. Cultures evolve, migrate, and sometimes adapt to new geographies. Ruins are not only remnants but active participants in new ecosystems, and acknowledging that agency reframes preservation as a form of stewardship rather than rescue. There are ethical debates about repatriation when artifacts found underwater are removed to distant museums. Claims and counterclaims complicate matters, for multiple communities may have legitimate ties to an object. Resolving these disputes involves law, diplomacy, and often a recognition that tangible heritage connects to living identity in ways that transcend scholarly curiosity. Technology that simulates submerged environments is increasingly used in education, allowing people who cannot dive to experience a sense of these worlds. Virtual reality can recreate the light and soundscape of an underwater temple, while augmented reality brings artifacts into classrooms. Such tools can democratize access, but they are simulations, useful for engagement while reminding us that they are not substitutes for the real material record. One of the most profound lessons from submerged civilizations is the humility they instill about human plans. Cities that seemed permanent were always vulnerable to nature's patient forces. Recognizing that vulnerability can recalibrate modern perspectives on sustainability, encouraging societies to design with resilience and adaptivity in mind rather than hubris. There are also stories of continuity, where coastal peoples simply moved their settlements inland or upstream and retained cultural frameworks that had emerged by the sea. Those migrations are less dramatic than a city swallowed whole, but they reveal endurance and continuity in the face of environmental pressures. The past is therefore not only a narrative of endings but also of adaptation and survival. Mythic narratives about drowned gods sometimes reassert themselves in contemporary culture, reappearing in festivals and in the iconography of coastal towns that still look to old patron saints or deities for protection. These revived rituals can be sincere acts of remembrance or creative reinventions designed to attract visitors. Either way, the presence of such practices underscores the persistent human need to anchor identity in place. When the ocean yields a new discovery, the ripple effects are broad: scientific studies, ethical debates, new museum exhibits, and renewed local pride. Each recovered shard becomes a node in a network of knowledge, connecting specialists and laypeople across disciplines. That network is ultimately social, because heritage matters most when it resonates with living communities who care about the stories. There are also instances where the very idea of a lost underwater city becomes a kind of cultural commodity, feeding tourism and lore in ways that can distort the historical record. Cities imagined in exploitative tropes, Atlantis is a frequent example, can overshadow real sites that demand attention for their own specificities. Distinguishing myth from archaeologically grounded narratives is an ongoing responsibility for educators and storytellers alike. But beneath the myths and the merchandise, the sea continues to hold its patient record, sometimes offering up the odd, the intimate, and the profound. A child's clay toy, an elegantly engraved amulet, a ship's beam, a row of stone bollards, each piece reframes a moment in which a human life intersected with the coastal world. Those intersections are what make submerged civilizations emotionally resonant rather than merely archaeological curiosities. This is why the work of telling these stories matters. The past under the sea teaches us about human creativity, vulnerability, and the way communities make meaning. When we reconstruct a guildhall's foundation or read a votive inscription to a forgotten goddess, we practice a form of empathy that stretches across centuries. That empathy helps us understand our own place in the world, reminding us that our footprints may also someday be submerged or transformed. As you imagine these scenes, picture the slow pressure of water over roofs, the hush of fish and the distant hum of current, and the way time accumulates like silt in corners. Think of the devotion once lavished on those temples, the commerce that bustled along reached docks, and the quiet habitations where people sewed, argued, loved, and grieved. The human dramas that unfolded there are no less vivid because they are no longer visible in daylight. They continue, folded into coral and stone. There are particular sites that have provided especially rich lessons, where preservation conditions were ideal and the archaeological record unusually coherent. In such places, entire workshops, sequences of building phases, and layers of ritual have been pieced together. These sites function as laboratories for understanding a broad range of human behaviors tied to maritime life, and they reveal patterns that can be compared across time and space. Yet every excavation begins with uncertainty. A promising sonar image could be bedrock, a promising fragment might prove to be modern debris, and conservation challenges can outstrip budgets. The work requires both the humility to accept unknowns and the stubbornness to pursue clarity through meticulous methods. It is careful, often slow, and always subject to revision as new data arrives. Public engagement is a crucial component of preserving submerged heritage. When local people, schoolchildren, and tourists are invited into the story, they often become the most ardent protectors. Education transforms curiosity into stewardship, and stewardship can, in turn, ensure that future generations can continue to explore and learn from these submerged testimonies. Across history, water has been both provider and eraser, and that duality is central to the drama of sunken civilizations. It gave life to harbors and took away the structures that sustained those economies, and a rhythm that confounded and compelled people to adapt. Those adaptations, recorded in material culture and ritual, tell of resilience more often than of resignation. Legal frameworks for underwater cultural heritage have developed in response to the need to protect sites from exploitation and irreparable loss. Laws are imperfect, they are contested, and they reflect the politics of ownership and access. Yet they also represent a collective recognition that the traces of human life deserve protection because they are part of a shared story. The future of submerged worlds will be shaped by the choices we make now about conservation, research priorities, and public involvement. Will we invest in careful, collaborative scholarship or allow sites to be exhausted for short-term gain? How we answer these questions will determine not only what is preserved, but how those preserved items are contextualized and honored. People who work in the field often speak of the strange intimacy of their work, lifting a pot from silt, feeling the texture of its surface, and recognizing a maker's touch across millennia. That connection is a quiet, humbling reward, a sense that through material things we can touch lives that otherwise seem irretrievably distant. It is a form of human continuity that transcends the loss of empires. In the end, these submerged places are teachers, and they instruct us in the paradoxes of permanence and fragility. Monuments that seemed eternal crumble into nurseries for coral, artifacts intended for worship become part of ecological cycles. Personal trinkets that once comforted an individual become evidence in scholarly debates. The sea complicates the idea of endings and opens up a broader view of what it means to survive. When we speak of forgotten gods, we should remember that forgetting is rarely absolute. Even when formal worship ceases, elements of belief can persist in surprising ways, in place names, in folk sayings, and rituals that harbor traces of ancient practice. Religions are not static relics, but living organisms with long memories and unexpected avenues of transmission. At another level, the study of submerged civilizations invites humility about our own projections. We may arrive with grand theories and tidy frameworks, yet the materials often demand nuanced, patient listening. The sea rewards curiosity and patience more than it does certainty, and that is part of what makes the field both challenging and endlessly fulfilling. So imagine standing on a modern shore at dusk, watching the tide withdraw and then return, and know that under that movement lies a palimpsest of human enterprise. Cities sleep and awake in the ocean's memory, gods shift their garments, and trade winds write marginalia on coastlines. Each ebb and flow is a reminder that the past is not sealed away but is an active part of the present, waiting for those who will listen carefully enough to hear its stories. The narration of these lost worlds is ongoing, and each season brings fresh finds, new arguments, and renewed wonder. As technology improves and as more people invest in collaborative, respectful scholarship, the depth of our understanding deepens. What we recover is never merely an object, but a sentence in a much longer story, a story we are still learning to read and to tell with care. Night on the ocean is not empty, it is a living veil that breathes and shifts. From the deck you can feel the dark pressing, a cool weight that the world above forgets. Waves fold in silence, and something deeper stirs beyond the reach of flashlight cones and GPS ticks. It is there, in that vast black, that the leviathans sleep and listen, immense and patient as tectonic plates. The first sign is never what you expect. It might be a subtle rearrangement of the currents, a tide that hesitates as if recalculating its path. The ship's hull shivers once, a small complaint that speaks to pressure and distance. On the bridge a hand freezes mid-gesture, ears strain for the impossible. It is not thunder, not engine trouble, it is a living calculus, the ocean adjusting to the presence of something vast. Leviathans are not monsters from a child's nightmare, nor are they beasts carved from a sailor's tall tale. They are creatures tuned to an environment so alien that our languages feel fragile when we try to name them. Their bodies are sculpted by pressures that would crush us, by light so rare that living beneath it requires a different dictionary of sensation. To study them is to learn a new grammar of existence, where weight and whisper mean more than sight. Imagine a spine long enough to cross a coastline, vertebrae like the columns of ruined temples, each joint a cathedral of cartilage and bone. Fins stretch like sails woven from night, edged with membranes that glow with slow, shifting bioluminescence. Tentacles might fan from a collar of armored plates, tipped with sensory pads that read electric fields instead of colors. Massive mouths can close like doors, and when they open they do not scream but unroll like the unfurling of an ancient map. They have been called gods and demons because we start from myth when we face what we cannot measure. For centuries, fishermen whispered of shadows that moved against the current, of birds that fell silent above unknown water. Cultures passed down names and rituals around fires because rituals restrained fear and gave patterns to the unpredictable. Those names are not wrong, they are human attempts to fold leviathans into stories so that people could sleep through storms. Science, with its instruments and patient curiosity, has slowly braided those stories into facts and then into deeper mysteries. Sonar maps show bulges where the seabed would not expect them, thermal imaging detects breath-like heat signatures around abyssal vents, and DNA fragments in seawater hint at lineages that diverged before mammals walked the land. Each piece of data is a thread that leads into a tapestry too vast for a single mind to hold. The instruments give us numbers, but the living creatures give us context. When a leviathan awakens, the ocean remembers how to speak. A chorus of low-frequency calls can travel thousands of miles through deep sound channels, a language written in vibrations and pressure gradients. Submarine scientists, tuned to human ranges, first confuse these for tectonic groans and then, slowly, for deliberate phrases. The calls arrive as shapes in a spectrogram, elegant arches, and persistent tones that begin to resolve into patterns like grammar. Those patterns are not random. They stitch together information about currents and prey and territory. One long, rolling note can mean moving across the ridge, while a rapid series of pulses might signal danger or invitation. Leviathans exchange these sonic sentences with a logic driven by fluid dynamics and ancient instincts. They are communicating not in words but in changes of pressure and time, and our task is to translate that music into understanding. Listening to their song is like learning to read a new score. Human ears are clumsy, preferring high frequencies and crisp edges, while the deep ocean favors slow, full-bodied notes that sweep across minutes. Once you attune, you begin to hear shape in the long hums, a curl of sensation that maps to a fin stroke, a low knell that aligns with a tail pivot. Researchers have sat in submersibles with tears dried on their cheeks, not from fear but from the awe of hearing such an enormous mind sing. The Leviathan's biology is a study in extremes. Their muscles are dense with proteins that behave differently under pressure, folding into configurations that maintain elasticity when everything else becomes static. Their blood carries gases in ways we can barely imagine, binding oxygen more tightly to survive long, slow dives and releasing it with precision during sudden bursts of activity. Skin, when visible, shows complex patterns of light and dark that can shift like weather to camouflage or communicate. The physiology reads like a manual for life at the border of possibility. Their eyes, when they exist, are not always round or reflective. Some leviathans possess compound retinas that harvest the faint bioluminescent glows of the deep, stitching them into an impressionistic awareness of the world. Others have evolved pressure-sensitive flaps and lateral line systems that feel the ocean's minute currents like threads of silk on the skin. To them, the world is texture and flow, a tapestry of movement and electric whispers more intelligible than the color of light. Diet and hunting strategies are as varied as their forms. A leviathan might filter vast swaths of plankton through baleen plates as wide as sails, drawing the ocean into a mouth that closes around entire clouds of life. Another might be an ambush predator, coiling around a hydrothermal vent to wait until prey is drawn by warm mineral-rich plumes. Some graze on chemosynthetic mats that grow in the darkness, nibbling colonies of extremophile organisms with precision that seems almost reverent. Each feeding style maps onto a different niche, and together they help sustain the deep's complex web. There are leviathans that farm on a scale that makes human agriculture look tiny. They cultivate fields of glowing algae along their flanks, coaxing light-producing symbionts with the warmth of their bodies and the chemical richness of their skin. These gardens provide not only nourishment but also communication. A ripple through the algae can signal mood or intent to companions. Such mutualism changes our notion of animal industry. Here, tending a crop is an ethical act bound into daily life. Leviathans display behaviors that suggest forms of social structure we barely understand. They travel in migrations that span coastlines and basins, a league of giants moving with the currents like a caravan of living continents. Within these groups, individuals assume roles: sentinels who patrol edges, elders who keep memory through song, juveniles who play in thermal eddies learning to manage their buoyancy. The emphasis falls not on hierarchy as we know it, but on interdependence, a tapestry of tasks that keeps a fragile balance. Play, in the deep, is both practice and pleasure. Juveniles wrestle in slow-motion water, their collisions cushioned by pressure and practiced control. Such play builds the rhythm and muscle memory necessary for foraging and courtship. We have watched juvenile leviathans recreate hunting sequences beneath the light of their parents' bioluminescent halo, turning serious skills into games that teach and bind. It is a tender scene beneath a skyless ceiling. Mating rituals rival the ocean's most elaborate dances. They begin with calls, low and insistent, that gather interested parties from miles away. Body displays follow, flaring membranes that shimmer, trails of phosphorescent cells arranged like ribbons, and synchronized undulations that seem to taste the water for compatibility. Mate choice is as much about cooperation as it is about attraction. Partners seek allies who will help raise not just offspring, but entire microhabitats around vents and nutrient plumes. This makes reproduction a community project, an investment in the next chorus. Offspring come into a world of pressure and patience. Some leviathans bear live young, releasing calves that are born with a startling amount of instinctual competence, the ability to hold depth, to locate thermal microhabitats, to recognize the song of kin. Others scatter thousands of eggs into nutrient-rich currents, trusting that a few will find the right chemistry and shelter to grow. Parental care varies but is often elaborate, involving protection through migration and the teaching of migration routes like elders telling a map in motion. The lifespan of a leviathan bends our sense of time. Many live for centuries, their growth slow and patient as corals. A single life may span the reign of dynasties along distant coasts, witnessing climatic shifts and the slow drift of an ocean floor. They retain memory not as human episodic recall but as layers of muscle memory and song that encode geography and danger across generations. In their long lives, they become living archives of the sea. Because they persist, leviathans act as agents of ecological memory. When they graze a field of microbial mats, they change the substrate, encouraging different species to flourish. When they move, their massive bodies stir nutrient layers that promote plankton blooms, which in turn fuel fish populations. Their migrations mark the rhythms of entire ecosystems, and when those rhythms change, ripple effects cascade like falling dominoes through food webs. Humans, who have relied on those higher rhythms for fisheries and coastal livelihoods, have felt these shifts without always understanding the cause. Encounters with leviathans have always tested human imagination and ethics. Early explorers saw them as omens. Later, scientists sought to quantify them. Fishermen marked territories with stories of luck and loss. Modern technology complicates these relations. Submersibles probe their hide, tagging devices whisper data back to research vessels, while deep rigs for mining or fossil fuels puncture the very habitats leviathans depend on. Each interaction raises questions about consent, stewardship, and the unintended consequences of curiosity. Who has the right to map a mind that evolved in a context we will never fully inhabit? The sea offers no simple answers. In one recorded incident, a research team deployed an acoustic lure designed to attract deep-sea cephalopods and instead drew a leviathan that had never been catalogued. The creature approached with a caution that was almost polite, extended an appendage like a probing instrument, and then recoiled when the net's edges flashed. Scientists debated the ethics for years, arguing whether the lure was a meaningful violation or a necessary test of curiosity. The leviathan, uninterested in human argument, returned to the black and resumed its slow, deliberate patrol. The dispute remained unresolved. Leviathans are shaped by environments we are just beginning to map: hydrothermal vents that smell of metal and life, methane seeps that feed complex food webs, and abyssal plains that hold sedimentary records of epochs. Each microhabitat encourages adaptation. Around vents, creatures evolve heat tolerance and chemical metabolism. In sedimentary plains, slow, efficient feeding mechanisms prevail. Understanding leviathans demands a lateral view of ecology, where biology merges with geology and chemistry in a continuous conversation. Some species use the ocean's chemical gradients like a language. They read the taste of salts and minerals to find mates, to avoid predators, to detect the decay of old giants. Odors move slowly under pressure, like stories passed through a chain of kin. For creatures with centuries of memory, these chemical narratives are maps of history: the scent of a vent that changed course, the trace of a storm that altered currents, the salt-laden breath of a whale long since gone. These olfactory landscapes are as meaningful as any coastline to a leviathan. We have found fossil evidence that leviathan-like creatures roamed the seas in deep antiquity, ancient bones embedded in layers of rock that once were seabed. Paleontologists trace lineages that flicker like constellations, connecting forms across epochs. Fossilized musculature hints at a continuity of movement, a dance passed down like choreography. The deep sea is a museum and a living archive, where past and present knead into survival strategies that outlast human timescales. Legends across seafaring cultures often converge on similar traits: colossal size, a capacity for both destruction and protection, and a mysterious intelligence. These stories are not just fanciful tales, they carry kernels of observation. A whale that saved a ship from a storm becomes a protective spirit. A dark shadow capsizing a boat becomes a cautionary tale told to children. Such myths encode practical knowledge as well as awe, keeping entire communities aware of danger and respect for the sea. Traditions persist because they have utility. They are memory wrapped in narrative. When leviathans directly impact human life, the effect is always profound. Coastal communities sometimes find their nets rendered useless by sudden plankton blooms triggered by the stir of a leviathan. Fisheries plummet or surge with little warning. Infrastructure like underwater pipelines may be damaged by the push and pull of these great beings as they traverse seabeds, altering the landscape in ways engineers did not predict. These are not isolated events. They are a reminder that human systems sit atop ecosystems that we only partially understand. Those reminders can be brutal. Collisions between leviathans and submarines are rare, but when they occur, they reveal the fragility of human technology against the ocean's scale. A hole dented by a collision is a story told in metal, a scar on a machine that speaks of humility. Military and research vessels have adapted with reinforced structures and more cautious protocols, but adaptation is a dialogue, not a solution. The sea has a way of teaching lessons slowly, and often in the language of consequence. In response, scientists and ethicists have proposed frameworks for interacting with leviathans that mirror those developed for terrestrial megafauna. Protected corridors, sonar abstinence zones, and restrictions on deep mining near known migration paths are part of a conversation between governments, indigenous communities, and researchers. These policy tools are imperfect, and implementation is fraught with competing interests. Still, they represent an attempt to translate respect into law, to recognize that some lives in the ocean deserve the room to be themselves without exploitation. Whether such measures will be enough is an open question. Technology is both a threat and a bridge. New materials allow us to build quieter research platforms that minimize disturbance. Autonomous listening stations can monitor songs over decades, building databases that track changes like the world's slowest symphony. Genetic tracing from environmental DNA promises to tell us what lives in a kilometer square of water without a single net cast. Yet each advance nudges the balance, sometimes in unpredictable ways, and with every new window we open, responsibility deepens. We cannot merely observe, observation alters. Leviathans also challenge our definitions of intelligence. They solve problems of flow and pressure that seem algorithmic, yet they do so with creativity rather than calculation. They modify their behavior in response to human noise, altering migration timing and routes to reduce interference. Some individuals display problem-solving that resembles tool use, manipulating stones to create shelter, arranging algae in patterns that guide juveniles. To call this intelligence is to expand the category, to accept that minds need not mirror our own to be cognitive and worth study. Communication between species has long fascinated humans, and the idea of a bridge to Leviathan minds hums with temptation. Attempts to play back recorded calls have produced mixed results. Sometimes, recordings draw replies that linger for hours, as if the Leviathans mull over the human-made echoes. Other times, playbacks elicit aggression or avoidance, an expression of boundaries as intense as the decision to avoid a land predator. Reciprocity is possible, but it requires humility, patience, and the willingness to listen longer than it takes to speak. When we talk about awakening leviathans, we are not only speaking of individuals rising from slumber. We are referring to shifts in populations, synchronized awakenings triggered by environmental change, mating cycles, or the rediscovery of lost resources. An awakening can ripple like a seasonal bloom, and it can redefine entire coastlines. Fisheries that once knew stable cycles are thrown into chaos. Predators alter their hunting grounds. Entire communities of organisms recalibrate. These awakenings are not sudden anomalies, but integrated responses to planetary rhythms. Climate change complicates the picture in ways both subtle and dramatic. Warming waters alter thermal gradients that leviathans use as navigational landmarks. Acidification shifts the chemical cues that guide foraging. Changes in sea ice at the poles reroute migrations and open corridors where species once separated. Some leviathan populations adapt by shifting range or adjusting breeding timing, while others suffer the erosion of habitats they cannot replace. The ocean is forgiving in its own way, but there are thresholds beyond which adaptation becomes impossible. We live in an era that will test those limits. Yet amid the threats, there are surprises of resilience. Some leviathans have learned to exploit new man-made structures, nesting around submarine cables or using the heat from abandoned rigs as incubators for young. Other populations have altered their songs to avoid overlapping with human-generated noise, a cultural shift in the acoustic sphere that suggests flexibility and innovation. These adaptations do not absolve human responsibility, but they reveal the depth and inventiveness of life under pressure. The ocean is not passive, it pushes back and redesigns itself. The colors of their bioluminescence are not arbitrary. Blues thread into greens that signal curiosity, while reds, rare in the deep, flash as warnings. Patterns can propagate like a conversation across a group's flank, forming visual sentences that accompany sonic ones. When multiple leviathans gather, their lights can paint the water in living frescoes, a choreography that makes the sea look like a city of living lanterns. Witnessing such congregations rewires what people expect from the ocean's nighttime. Nocturnality becomes an art form. Sometimes leviathans act as architects. Their bodies carve channels through sediment, creating microhabitats where other species can thrive. They clear paths that guide larval dispersal, and their droppings become nutrient islands that support complex benthic communities. In this way, they are engineers of the deep, sculpting environments with movements that are at once graceful and consequential. Their presence structures biodiversity in ways that few other species can, and their removal is a loss that echoes across levels of life. We have discovered symbiotic relationships so intimate they border on civic partnership. Tiny cleaner creatures live in grooves along a leviathan's mouth, maintaining dental hygiene in exchange for a steady meal. Small fish dart in and out of the folds of a leviathan's fin, finding refuge from predators and repaying the favor by nudging parasites loose. Even microbes play roles, inhabiting external glands that secrete chemicals warding off harmful bacteria or signaling reproductive readiness. These partnerships are woven into the fabric of life, making each leviathan not an island but an ecosystem in motion. Leviathan intelligence may also express itself through memory traces embedded in landscape. A veteran will return to a submerged ridge to tap a stone in a ritualistic percussion with its fluke, a sound that might mark passageways for younger kin. Such ritual acts connect individuals across generations, shaping behavior in ways that are cultural rather than purely genetic. To lose elders, to remove those slow thinkers who carry maps of currents and songs, is to lose knowledge that cannot be relearned in a lab. Conservation, then, becomes an act of cultural preservation. Our own myths morph in response to monumental encounters. A coastal village that once feared a leviathan's shadow begins to reframe it as a harbinger of ecological renewal when fish returns follow a visit. Poets write new verses about the night when the sea lit itself in morning colors, and children invent games based on the slow undulation of giant tails. The relationship between humans and leviathans is dynamic, filled with grief and gratitude and the messy, ongoing work of cohabitation. Culture adapts, as life does. Occasionally, leviathans become focal points for broader environmental consciousness. Documentaries that capture their slow movements and songs bring millions into the hush of the deep, provoking campaigns to protect migratory corridors and reduce ocean noise. Art installations inspired by their bioluminescent patterns appear in city galleries, translating deep-sea rhythms into human spaces. These cultural bridges can shift public opinion and policy, reminding us that awe has political power and that beauty can be a catalyst for change. Yet the fascination can also backfire. Tourism fleets racing to witness Leviathan gatherings introduce noise and interference that stress the very creatures people came to admire. The desire to place a camera under a fin is understandable, but intensity of attention can turn an awakening into a wound. Ethics and observation must temper desire, and responsible witnessing requires restraint, a paradox that humans must learn to honor. Sometimes the best way to love a thing is to step back. There are stories of interspecies rescue that read like parables. In one well-documented case, a leviathan entangled in an abandoned trawl net drew the attention of local fishers who had long revered the animal. Instead of reflexively fearing it, they coordinated with scientists and freed the creature, using boats as leverage and strength in numbers to cut away the net. The leviathan remained calm throughout the rescue, a quiet presence whose eyes reflected a comprehension that blurred the line between human and non-human compassion. It swam off, leaving behind a new relationship forged from necessity and kindness. Such moments remind us that moral imagination can extend into the non-human world. Compassion is not solely a human trait when communities learn to act in the interest of other species. The bond formed between rescuers and Leviathan rippled outward, teaching future generations that stewardship is not a burdensome duty but a shared expression of belonging. In these interactions, we learn to see the sea as neighbor rather than resource. The ethical map broadens. Leviathans have become emissaries in dialogues about planetary health. Their presence and behavior encapsulate shifts in ocean chemistry, temperature, and human intrusion. Scientists use changes in their migration and song patterns as indicators, like barometers for the deep. When a leviathan route alters, researchers ask whether this is a response to prey movement, human noise, or deeper environmental change. The question does not always have one answer, often it has many, layered, and interacting. Understanding those layers is central to responsible stewardship. At the heart of the Leviathan story is a confrontation with scale. Our human narratives hinge on individual lives and immediate time frames. Leviathans broaden that sense, inviting us to think across centuries and to accept that some solutions are slow and communal. To conserve them is to commit to practices that outlive careers and election cycles. It demands patience and a willingness to invest in futures we will not inhabit. This is a political and philosophical challenge as much as it is a biological one. It asks whether humans can cultivate long-term thinking at a species level. Science fiction has long depicted leviathans as allies or adversaries in cosmic terms, and while fiction gives us dramatic metaphors, reality is subtler. Leviathans are neither gods nor villains. They are complex organisms responding to evolutionary imperatives and contemporary pressures. Their awakening is not a plot device but an ecological event with cascading consequences. The stories we tell about them influence how we respond. When fiction dignifies rather than demonizes, it can bolster empathy and policy. When it sensationalizes, it mobilizes fear. Both effects are real. In the laboratories that study these creatures, scientists come from many disciplines: biologists who measure, acousticians who translate, anthropologists who listen to human stories about leviathans, and ethicists who ask how we should act. These teams convene as if convening a chorus, each voice adding nuance to a shared tune. Their collaboration is itself a model for how to approach the unknown, with humility, with long attention spans, and with an openness to the lessons that living systems offer. Collaboration is the vessel that carries knowledge forward. The ocean teaches us through absence as much as presence. Areas where leviathans once traveled, now quiet, leave a silence that is itself a message. The sediment paints pictures of what was: bones, spirals of shells, and traces of chemical pulses preserved over millennia. Scientists read these archives like historians, piecing together tales of abundance and decline. The lessons are not only about loss but about resilience if conditions change and recovery becomes possible. Reading the seabed is learning to recognize both erasure and the possibility of return. We have also learned to listen for what leviathans warn us about. A sudden change in their song might indicate a shifting current that brings warmer water into fragile reefs, or a new industrial activity that alters the chemistry they depend on. In some cases, they react to natural disasters before humans do, moving away from undersea earthquakes or storm-generated currents. Their responses are early warning systems embedded in biology. Recognizing and acting on these warnings could save not just leviathans but communities that depend on the sea. Technology has offered creative ways to protect leviathans without isolating human communities. Acoustic quiet zones and dynamic no-go areas that change with migration cycles are targeted, nimble approaches that respect both livelihoods and life. Seasonal fishing limits aligned with breeding seasons can sustain fisheries while giving leviathans space to reproduce. These policies require trust and cooperation, coordination between scientists, governments, and local stakeholders, a network of social engineering that mirrors the ocean's own interdependence. When it works, it models how human systems can mimic natural resilience. Philosophically, leviathans force us to reckon with otherness at scale. They make us confront the limits of anthropocentrism, the comfortable but limiting assumption that human life is the measure of value. Watching a leviathan move with deliberation reveals a different kind of intelligence whose worth cannot be translated into resource utility. Respecting their ways is not merely conservationist rhetoric, it is a recalibration of moral perspective. It asks whether we can center the lives of beings whose time frames and experiential worlds differ from ours. That shift is neither easy nor quick. Artists have responded to leviathans with installations that translate deep songs into light and sculpture, making their presence tangible in human spaces. Musicians record long-tone compositions inspired by hydrophone data, and painters mimic the textures of pressure and skin. Through art, the ocean's moods enter urban life, and the leviathan's presence becomes a cultural touchstone. Art helps bridge the cognitive gap between fascination and policy by turning awe into empathy. It makes distant lives feel, for a moment, like neighbors. Educational initiatives have leveraged these stories to inspire young learners. Children who grow up hearing about the deep's gentle giants are more likely to enter careers in marine stewardship or to support sustainable practices. Youth programs that involve local communities in monitoring efforts create a generational ethic of care. In classrooms, the leviathan becomes a teacher of patience, reminding students that some of the most important systems operate on scales longer than a homework cycle or a school year. Education seeds futures that might protect these species. Leviathans have occasionally become catalysts for surprising alliances. Fishing communities and conservationists, who often clash, sometimes find common ground when a leviathan's movement directly influences catch. They may collaborate to design migratory corridors that both protect the leviathans and sustain livelihoods by improving fishery predictability. These collaborations are fragile but potent, illustrating that when roles shift from opposition to coordination, new solutions emerge. Cooperation becomes a living experiment in mutual benefit. The political economy around deep-sea resources complicates every decision. Mineral extraction interests, national security concerns, and coastal development pressures make conservation a tangled policy challenge. Leviathans, indifferent to national borders, contravene the neat lines we draw on maps. Successful protection thus requires international agreements, enforcement mechanisms, and an acknowledgement that ecological networks transgress sovereignty. The challenge becomes geopolitical as well as biological. It asks whether states can govern beyond their immediate sightlines. Science advances through patient accumulation of small discoveries. A single hydrophone recording that reveals a previously unknown song type might seem minor, but when aggregated with decades of data, it rewrites a species' behavioral map. Similarly, genetic analysis of skin sloughed from a leviathan can reconstruct population histories and migratory connectivity. Each small insight compounds, informing policies and deepening our appreciation of the ocean's complexity. Research is a long conversation, not a quick verdict. It rewards sustained listening. Public stories influence policy as much as data. A viral documentary that captures a leviathan's gentle curiosity can swing public sentiment and pressure lawmakers to act. Conversely, sensational stories that depict leviathans as threats can lead to fear-based policies that prioritize human dominance. The narrative we promote shapes the choices we make. Responsible storytelling, therefore, becomes a tool of stewardship as important as any technological innovation. The way we tell about the deep changes what we are willing to protect. Leviathans sometimes leave unexpected gifts. Their migrations can concentrate nutrients in predictable zones, creating accidental oases that local communities learn to harvest sustainably. This synchrony can form the basis of seasonal economies that respect biological rhythms. When humans align their activities with these patterns rather than overriding them, both cultural richness and ecological balance flourish. It is an example of how adaptation can be mutual and regenerative, not merely extractive. The lesson is practical and profound. There are also darker human impulses to face. The desire to claim, to commodify, to capture wonders for entertainment or profit has led to harmful practices. Capturing a young leviathan for a spectacle museum creates public outrage and fuels black markets. Regulation and enforcement are needed to prevent exploitation, but they alone cannot root out the appetite for quick profit. Cultural change, sustained by education and policy, is necessary to shift demand away from commodification toward reverence. Such shifts are slow but achievable. Researchers who spend decades in the field often develop a language of belonging when they speak about leviathans. They refer to their patches of ocean not as possessions but as areas of shared history, places where they have learned to read the songs and recognize the marks of individuals. Their narratives are restrained with awe and a professional humility that recognizes the limits of human knowledge. Listening becomes a discipline of respect, and over time that discipline shapes not just data but the character of science itself. The individuals who study leviathans become living bridges between worlds. Leviathans themselves might be seen as participants in planetary regulation. Their movements influence carbon sequestration by stirring deep waters and altering sediment deposition, and their feeding patterns can modulate plankton populations that draw down carbon. In ways both direct and subtle, they are part of the Earth's climate machine. Protecting them could therefore have benefits that ripple into atmospheric stability. The connections are complex, but they exist, reminding us that saving a species can sometimes mean saving a process on which we also depend. Philosophically, we are confronted with the humility of being part of a larger story. Leviathans do not serve human narratives, they carry their own. Learning to accept that fact is a spiritual as well as scientific exercise. It requires letting go of dominion and embracing stewardship that is generous and long-term. Perhaps the deepest gift Leviathans offer is the chance to expand our moral imagination and to practice care at planetary scales. That practice might be the most important legacy we leave. As night falls again and the sea breathes, Leviathans move through rhythms older than any human calendar. They wake and sleep and sing in cycles that weave ecosystems together. For those who slow down and listen, their songs are invitations to pay attention, to respect time, and to act with the patience that complex life requires. Their presence asks for nothing more than recognition and space, but even that modest request asks a lot of us. Choosing to hear is choosing to change. The ocean always remains a teacher. It shows us that life can take forms beyond our architectural metaphors, that intelligence can be distributed across muscle and water and light. Leviathans teach us that size does not equal brutality, that slow movement can be profound, and that memory can be encoded in currents as well as in brains. They are a reminder that the world's wonders are not finite resources but ongoing processes. Stewardship becomes, then, an act of tending to those processes. So we keep listening, one hydrophone at a time, gathering song after song, building lexicons of sound and behavior. We draft maps that follow great migrations, not to constrain them but to give them room. We teach new generations to translate oceanic rhythms into policy and practice. And when we can, we step back and watch, allowing the Leviathans to live on their own terms. That is a fragile, imperfect, and necessary work. It is the slow art of coexistence. The story of Leviathans is not a single narrative with a tidy ending. It is a braided tale of biology, culture, policy, catastrophe, and hope. It is a series of awakenings, some tragic, some restorative, and each has lessons for how we share a planet with beings whose time scales challenge our impatience. If we are attentive, we will learn to measure success not by the speed of intervention but by the resilience we help nurture in the ocean's slow systems. Leviathans awaken us to responsibility. May we, in turn, awaken to our part in their story. There is a kind of hush that comes when you imagine sinking into the deepest crack on Earth, the long blade between tectonic plates where light gives up and pressure becomes a form of silence. Picture the ocean falling away until the world above is a rumor, and know that the trenches hold not only water but a catalog of truths stored like sound in a well. They are places where time smells different, where memory is compressed into mud and bone and slow chemical whispers. As you listen, the narrating voice becomes an echo itself, returning questions you did not know you carried. As the sea deepens, senses narrow. Color fades first, then form, until everything is reduced to gradients of black and the faint glows of living lamps. Pressure becomes the geometry of existence, folding organisms into hardy, unusual shapes and setting the rules for how life can move and speak. In that compressed world, sounds travel differently, and every vibration has a story to tell. Sound is how the trenches tell their past. Noise from storms, ship engines, migrating whales, and the grinding of plates all fold into an acoustic landscape that human ears rarely hear directly. Sonar pulses, whale songs, and the click of crustaceans combine to create a living chorus, and researchers have learned to listen for changes in tone, for the single note that reveals a distant animal or a shifting slope. Those echoes are data, memory, and metaphor at once. Geography helps explain the drama. Trenches form where one tectonic plate dives beneath another, carving deep furrows along the planet's skin. The Mariana Trench, the deepest of them, is a canyon that drops farther than many mountains rise, its deepest point known as Challenger Deep. Each trench has its own character, shaped by past collisions, volcanic intrusions, and the slow creep of continents. Pressure at hadal depths alters physics in subtle ways. It makes gases dissolve, it compresses tissues, and it pushes proteins into shapes rare on the surface. Creatures adapt by changing the chemistry of their cells, replacing rigid structures with flexible gels and letting membranes become porous and forgiving. Those adaptations are not grand spectacles but small, ingenious solutions that let life persist where the sea itself seems determined to crush it. If sunlight never arrives, energy must come from elsewhere, and that elsewhere is often chemistry. Hydrothermal vents and cold seeps inject heat and mineral-rich fluids into the dark, feeding ecosystems built on sulfur and methane instead of sunlight. Microbial communities there convert inorganic molecules into organic matter in a process called chemosynthesis, and their existence rewrites the rule that life requires light. Those vents are like underwater hearths, places of warmth and invention in a world of chill. In the cloudless black, bioluminescence becomes a language. Tiny organisms produce light to attract mates, confuse predators, or signal allies, creating a living constellation of purposeful flashes. Some species use light as camouflage, matching the faint downwelling glow to vanish from hungry silhouettes below. The patterns are often complex and rhythmic, a private syntax evolved over eons of night. Trenches also act as archives. Cold temperatures and low oxygen slow decomposition, and the mud preserves bones, wooden beams, and the detritus of centuries. Shipwrecks that quickly rot elsewhere can remain surprisingly intact in the Hadal realm, their stories written in barnacle patterns, and the distribution of nails and cargo, in the way a whole has been cannibalized by time and organisms. Archaeologists and biologists read those layers like pages of a book, each sedimentary horizon a line in a long poem. The ocean's acoustic memory is not only biological, it is infrastructural. Submarine cables, the literal threads of global communication, lie like veins across abyssal plains and disappear into trenches at certain points. Their hums, their repairs, the rumbles from nearby drilling, and the thunder of storms are all folded into the soundscape, producing an intermingling of natural and human echoes. When researchers deploy hydrophones, they hear strange, polyglot music that speaks of currents, whales, earthquakes, and ships. Human exploration of the deepest trenches began as a mixture of curiosity and daring. The bathyscaphe Trieste carried 2 men to Challenger Deep in 1960, a small, armored craft pressing down into a place no human had stood before. Decades later, James Cameron's solo descent rekindled global imagination, filming a world that looked alien and intimate at once. Each dive writes a small ledger of human presence, a brief visitation that leaves behind instruments and impressions. Technology has pushed those dives from myths to methodical science. Remotely operated vehicles, autonomous underwater vehicles, and specialized sensors extend reach and record detail that human bodies cannot endure. These machines measure temperature, chemistry, and life with patient, tireless hands. They map the seafloor, photograph the living, and carry back samples for the labs above. Their mechanical voices have become extensions of human curiosity, translating the quiet deep into data we can read. Time and again, the trenches have offered surprises that shatter expectations. Scientists have encountered giant amphipods, waxy, soft-bodied creatures, and transparent fish that seem to belong to another planet. Sometimes life seems to skirt every rule we assume is universal, manifesting in long, drifting ribbons or in blob-shaped animals that defy conventional categories. Each discovery forces a small revision of what we think of as possible, like a whisper changing the outline of a map. Below the visible life there is a rich microbial world that quietly drives chemistry. Microbes process carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and metals in ways that make entire ecosystems possible. They form mats, build chimneys of mineral deposits, and supply the organic scaffolding on which larger animals depend. Modern DNA tools have revealed bewildering genetic diversity in these microbes, and with each gene sequenced we find new metabolic tricks and evolutionary histories that alter our view of life's tree. The chemistry of trenches includes stores and fluxes that tie into global systems. Methane hydrates, ice-like cages trapping methane molecules, live below sediments and can release large amounts of greenhouse gas under certain conditions. The seafloor acts as a sponge and a furnace, holding and transforming carbon in ways that are still imperfectly understood. Deep sediments may sequester organic material for millennia, and their disturbance could have cascading consequences for climate. Those chemical processes mean that trenches are not isolated curiosities but active players in global climate dynamics. Material sinking from surface waters carries carbon to the deep, where burial in sediments removes it from the short-term cycle. Conversely, disturbances from earthquakes or human activity can remobilize that carbon, returning it to the water column and eventually the atmosphere. Thus, the hidden truth of the trenches is political as well as physical, and the choices we make on ship decks and in trading floors can echo down into the dark for centuries. Human appetites have turned toward the deep as a source of minerals and rare earth elements. Polymetallic nodules litter certain abyssal plains with manganese, cobalt, nickel, and copper, and the economic pressure to harvest them is rising. Companies and nations speak of a new frontier of resource extraction, promising wealth but risking ecosystems that have existed in near isolation for millennia. The ethical calculus here is difficult. The deep, slow life cycles and patchy distributions mean that recovery from disturbance may be measured in human generations rather than years. Legal frameworks strain to keep pace. The law of the sea, embodied in treaties like UNCLOS, establishes rules about territorial waters and the high seas, but enforcement is difficult at hadal depths. Questions about ownership, bioprospecting, and environmental protection become thorny when the locations are remote and the stakes high. International scientists and policymakers gather to weigh the benefits against the irreversible changes mining could bring. And their debates are themselves a kind of echo of older conversations about colonization and resource use. Every culture with a coastline carries myths about the deep, stories of monsters, drowned cities, and gods who took what people gave them. Those tales are not simply quaint, they encode long human relationships with the sea, cautionary notes, and reverent acknowledgments of forces beyond human control. Fishermen and coastal elders speak of trawls coming back empty and of changes in fish behavior long before scientists notice trends, and their oral histories can contain knowledge that helps interpret modern data. Whales cast their songs across these deep realms, and those songs are living bridges between shallow and deep. Low-frequency moans and long calls travel vast distances and sometimes reach into trench basins, where the sound pitches differently and resurfaces as spatial memory. Whales use sound to navigate, find food, and socialize, and when their vocalizations encounter modern noise, from shipping lanes or seismic surveys, the interruption can cause confusion and harm. Those interruptions are audible to the listening devices left in trenches, and they register as altered patterns in a complex sonic tapestry. Acoustic pollution is not abstract, it translates into behavioral changes among animals that rely on sound. Military sonar, exploratory airgun blasts, and the constant thrum of commercial shipping can mask whale songs, scramble fish communication, and send predators into patterns of avoidance. The trenches, though remote, are not immune, because sound travels efficiently through water and can concentrate within certain geometries of the seafloor. The result is an anthropogenic layering of noise over an ancient music. Beneath the sediment lie shipwrecks and lost cities, artifacts of human journeys and errors. Some wrecks are the final words of trade routes, laden with ceramics, coins, and the detritus of private lives. Diving into wrecks merges the marine scientist with the archaeologist, careful excavation reveals trade patterns, material cultures, and sometimes personal tragedies. The deep does not erase human history so much as tuck it away, preserving it in a slow, aqueous archive. The seafloor reveals secrets with a kind of quiet relentlessness when you map it with sonar. High-resolution surveys unroll textures and shadows that speak of ancient river mouths now submerged, of lands once walked and now drowned. They reveal the paths of ancient tsunamis and the scars of earthquakes, a geological narrative that complements the biological and acoustic stories. Each map redraws our understanding of how the Earth changed and how quickly human life was sometimes forced to adapt. In addition to being a repository of memory, the deep is a warehouse of potential medicines and novel compounds. Organisms that survive under extremes may produce unique molecules to protect their cells, and those molecules can inspire drugs that target human disease. From antibiotics to cancer therapeutics, the promise is real, and scientists race to catalog biodiversity before habitats change irrevocably. The ethical question is how to balance discovery with respect for ecosystems too slow to defend themselves against sudden exploitation. Pollution reaches everywhere, and the trenches bear witness to that inconvenient truth. Microplastics have been found in samples from the deepest basins, and the fragments tell a story of surface consumption carried down as food, feces, or detritus. Even isolated trenches are not immune to the pervasive flow of our waste, and the presence of plastic in those sediments is a mute, bleak commentary on global systems of production and disposal. Debris accumulates in the hadal zones in odd ways. The rough topography, the pull of currents, and the slow settling of particles mean that certain depressions become traps where matter gathers like leaves in a yard. Scientists have found everything from intact bottles to degraded fishing gear in these traps, and each item becomes an emblem of connection. The deep is remote, but it is not disconnected. That accumulation raises tough questions about cleanup, responsibility, and the logistics of intervening where human hands rarely reach. Yet the deep is not simply fragile. It also displays resilience that can be humbling. After earthquakes or landslides, life returns according to rhythms unseen on land, with bacteria arriving first and larger animals following at a pace that seems languid to us but is perfectly calibrated to the environment. Recovery is slow but not impossible, and in some places organisms have persisted through cycles of disturbance for millions of years. That resilience should not be an excuse for complacency, however, because the pace of human-induced change may outstrip the ability of communities to rebound. Listening devices placed on the seafloor reveal a surprising variety of sounds, some predictable and some unforgettable. Hydrophone arrays pick up the persistent creak of tectonics, the patter of rain at the surface, the distant rumble of ice calving, and the sharp clicks of crustaceans. Patterns emerge over time, and scientists learn to read those patterns the way a musician reads score. Anomalies command attention because they may announce phenomena like submarine landslides or unexplained biological blooms. The soundscape is both a tool and an artwork of the deep. I once read a report where a hydrophone in a trench captured the low, moaning call of a whale followed hours later by the rumble of a magnitude event. The sequence told a story, animals navigating a shifting landscape, geology altering the seascape, and instrumentation stitching the narrative together across time. Moments like that remind us the ocean is a theater of processes on wildly different scales, each acting out its subplot in parallel. Plate tectonics are the scriptwriters of trench formation, moving continents like actors on a slow-moving stage. Subduction zones consume crust and recycle it into mantle, and the deposits left behind record episodes of mountain building, mass extinction, and ocean chemistry shifts. Over geological time, the trenches migrate, deepen, silt up, or change character, and what was once a violent, churning boundary can become a quiet backwater where unique life adapted to a very specific set of conditions. Thermal and chemical gradients near vents and seeps create narrow bands of abundance in a broader wasteland of scarcity. Life clusters where energy is available, forming hotspots that resemble lush oases within deserts of darkness. Those gradients are delicate lines between feast and famine, and small changes in flow or chemistry can reorganize the entire community. The deep's economy is one of margins, where organisms exploit narrow windows of opportunity. Adaptations to the deep are often subtle and elegant rather than flamboyant. Slow metabolisms allow creatures to live on minimal energy, reproductive strategies favoring fewer but more developed offspring increase survival odds, and flexible body plans let animals withstand crushing forces. Some species produce antifreeze proteins or methane processing enzymes, others have eyes that detect the faintest glows or have abandoned sight altogether in favor of other senses. Evolution here is improvisation under constant constraint. Predators in the deep are often opportunists, adapted to scarcity by being patient and efficient. Giant isopods feast when carcasses fall, hagfish slither into crevices and consume soft tissue, and amphipods swarm when a meal appears. Predatory strategies can be ambush, slow pursuit, or simple scavenging, and the balance between these modes shapes the structure of communities. Even in a place with little visible life, food webs are present and intricate. The sources of food are themselves a fascinating cascade of processes. Surface production, phytoplankton blooms, and sinking particles collectively form marine snow that drifts slowly to the seafloor. Large carcasses, whales, seals, and fishes deliver sudden bonanzas, and chemosynthetic communities rely on constant geological seepage. The result is a patchwork of abundance and deprivation, and organisms must track both the predictable and the stochastic with strategies honed over millions of years. In the silence of the deep, human minds tend to project both fear and wonder. The dark invites stories of monsters and possession, but it also compels a kind of humility. When scientists and explorers return from Hadal dives, they often speak in smaller, more precise language, marveled by the fragility of surface assumptions and the sturdiness of life that perseveres in slow, patient forms. Those explorers' voices are often reflective, shaped by the intimacy of being present where few humans ever are. They tell of seeing a single light blink in the dark and feeling suddenly less alone, or of encountering a creature that defies easy description and wanting to give it a name. The narratives bridge scientific observation and personal transformation, and the trenches become both laboratory and confessional. The deep has also altered the way we speak about time and distance. When organisms live on scales of decades between reproductive events or when sediments accumulate at millimeters per thousand years, human urgency can seem absurd. That perspective is not a dismissal of action but a reminder that stewardship sometimes requires patience and long-term thinking, planning on a timescale that exceeds political cycles and quarterly reports. Technological futures promise maps of unprecedented detail and fleets of robotic explorers that can survey the Hadal realm continuously. Satellite altimetry, interferometric soundings, and swarms of AUVs could, in the near future, transform our knowledge from patches to a continuous portrait. That expansion of sight will bring both knowledge and responsibility, because with greater visibility comes harder ethical choices about intervention and use. Speculation about unknown life forms is not mere fantasy. Molecular surveys hint at entire branches of life poorly represented in current taxonomies, and biochemical pathways unfamiliar to surface organisms appear in deep microbes. The possibility of new metabolic strategies, novel pigments, and even enzymes that function under extreme pressure or cold holds promise for biotechnology and a deeper understanding of biology itself. What seems like science fiction today may become routine knowledge tomorrow. As possibilities multiply, so does the need for governance and restraint. International agreements and marine protected areas are tools being discussed and deployed to slow the rush toward exploitation. Scientists push for baseline surveys and impact assessments before any large-scale activity, and some organizations argue for moratoria on deep-sea mining until the ecological consequences are better understood. These debates are part of the larger question of how humanity reconciles the thirst for resources with the duty to preserve a shared planet. The trenches also force us to confront the metaphoric weight of depth in our language. We speak of deep emotions, deep knowledge, and profound silence, drawing on the sea as a well of images for interstates. The physical reality, the immense pressure, the slow time, the dim light, amplifies those metaphors and sometimes reshapes them, reminding us that depth can be a place of abundance and austerity alike. Because the Hadal world is remote, stories from it carry a special cultural freight. Filmmakers, writers, and musicians have reached back into those dark landscapes for imagery and mood, often translating scientific nuance into symbolic form. Those creative works matter because they expand public imagination, helping people care about places they will never see but that nonetheless influence planetary health. The arts can turn data into empathy, and empathy into public will. In daily life, the choices we make ripple outward, reaching into trenches in ways we rarely track. The food we consume, the clothes we wear, the energy we demand, all feed systems connected by currents, trade routes, and chemical fluxes to the deep. Recognizing that connection is not about guilt so much as about clarity. Hello, world, you are part of a larger system, and our responsibilities extend into spaces we cannot easily visit. Listening to the ocean's echoes teaches patience. Long-term monitoring reveals trends invisible in short snapshots and small signals. An uptick in methane emissions, a shift in species composition, can presage larger transformations. The Hadal zones demand that we think in decades and centuries, and that we build institutions and practices that can hold knowledge across generations. That is an organizational challenge as much as a scientific one. The question of value haunts the conversation. How do we weigh the deep's intrinsic wonder against the tangible benefits of resource extraction? Is biodiversity priceless, or is it an asset to be priced and traded? Those questions shimmer with complexity, and the trenches, remote, unexplored, and slow to recover, magnify the stakes of any decision. And yet there is a kind of hope sewn into the same fabric of concern. Human ingenuity has built instruments that let us listen, see, and sample in places we once feared to approach. International collaborations have cataloged species, proposed protected areas, and pressed for responsible policies. Scientists have proposed creative mechanisms such as biodiversity offsets and deep-sea trusts to fund conservation, and some companies have voluntarily avoided the most sensitive sites. Progress is uneven, but it exists. Every expedition seems to return with new questions as much as answers. A sediment core reveals ancient climate cycles, a DNA sample unveils unexpected relationships, a video shows behavior never seen before. Knowledge accumulates like silt, layer upon layer, and with each increment our picture of the deep becomes more textured and stranger. That is both thrilling and sobering. The more we learn, the more we realize how much remains unknown. The trenches are also places of paradox. They are both the planet's most physically extreme environments and some of its least explored. They are repositories of human detritus and cradles of novel life. They are at once silent and noisy, isolated and connected, stable and subject to abrupt change. Those contradictions resist tidy summaries and invite ongoing attention. In the end, perhaps the real echo is not a sound returning from a trench, but an idea returned to us altered. The deeper we listen, the more the world reshapes our metaphors and our politics. We approach with instruments and ethics, with sonar pings and cautious treaties, and we come away with the sense that the planet's most hidden places are not separate from human fate. The trenches ask for a kind of stewardship that is patient and curious rather than acquisitive and fast. They ask us to think in terms of centuries, to value processes that are slow, and to protect communities whose timescales are not our own. If we can learn to respond in those ways, perhaps the echoes we leave will be ones of care and curiosity rather than plunder. Finally, when you return your attention to the world above, when you glance at the line of the horizon or hear the rumble of a storm, carry with you the knowledge that the deep is a living participant in Earth's story. It keeps records, it hosts experiments in survival, it stores carbon and holds secrets, and it teaches us humility. Listening is an act of responsibility, and the trenches remain one of the planet's most eloquent teachers, still speaking in ways we are only beginning to understand. The ocean begins as a surface of light where wind sketches patterns and gulls fold the air. As you listen, imagine the sunlight thinning, the blue deepening until it becomes a memory of light rather than light itself. This is the slow surrender, the first part of a descent that takes us through layers of silence toward the heart of the deep sea mysteries. Once you leave the surface, the water takes on the feel of weight and elongation, a pressure that accrues not like a single blow but like a patient hand pressing down. The day travels with you at first, slanting through the thermocline where warm and cold waters trade places, and plankton make drifting cities of themselves. Below that transition, the world becomes a different country, where common sense built under the sun begins to misplace its footing. The twilight zone greets you like a dusk that never resolves into night, a world where eyes know light only as suggestion. Creatures here are sculpted by compromise, many keep the machinery of light even as the light fades, and bioluminescence becomes a language. You will meet fish that flash like distant shore lamps and squid that paint signals in the water, each blink carrying a bargaining chip of mating, threat, or camouflage. Drifting further, the deep becomes midnight, but it is not an absence so much as an inversion. Sound plays a larger role as sight diminishes, pressure alters shapes and the chemistry of flesh and shell. The animals here are not merely surviving in darkness, they are thriving by exploiting every gradient of energy and matter that sinks from above or rises from below. There is a particular hush emerging between these paragraphs, a steadying breath that carries you now toward the abyssal plains, the vast flatness that spreads like a desert under a black sky. On these plains, sediment falls in slow, unhurried sheets and the remains of surface life carpet the seafloor in a frayed tapestry. Life is sparse by surface standards, but every grain of detritus supports an economy of scavengers, microbes, and opportunists whose lives are perfectly adjusted to scarcity. Beneath the plains, the deep hides its trenches, the hadal zones that are gashes in the planet, carved by tectonic fury. The Challenger deep in the Mariana Trench is a name that echoes with human curiosity, a place where a single descent is an act of daring and of listening to the planet's beating heart. To imagine falling into that chasm is to imagine entering a pressure chamber where time itself feels compacted and every breath is negotiation. Here, pressure is a sculptor. Creatures at these depths have membranes and proteins composed to resist being crushed. Their bodies are soft, often gelatinous, and contain oils and structures that do not collapse. Eyes, when present, are sometimes enormous and sometimes utterly absent, replaced by heightened sensitivity to motion, vibration, and the faintest chemical cues that might announce a meal or a mate. Hydrothermal vents are the deep's improbable furnaces, chimneys of mineral and heat that belch black smoke and host ecosystems that shudder to life. At these vents, sunlight is irrelevant and chemical energy becomes the currency of life, with microbes oxidizing hydrogen sulfide into the building blocks of whole communities. Giant tubeworms, armored clams, and armored crabs live in uncanny abundance around these fissures, their relationships with microbes as intimate as marriage. Chemosynthesis at vents reads like a counterargument to the idea that life must have light. Microbial mats shimmer with colors and textures that feel alien, yet fully logical, forming the base of a food web that owes nothing to the sun. The animals that have specialized around these vents show the inventive breadth of evolution. Bacteria live inside organisms, thread into tissues, and share energy like a hidden economy. Cold seeps offer a softer, still potent version of this chemical bounty, where methane and other hydrocarbons seep from the sediments to feed microbial layers. Where methane meets sulfate, life knits itself into dense thickets of clam and mussel, and microbial carpets draw in carbon that might otherwise bubble into the sea. These communities remind us that the deep is a mosaic of energy sources and that life will assemble wherever gradients of chemistry and temperature allow. The phenomenon of whale falls demonstrates an unexpected generosity in the deep sea. When a whale dies and its carcass descends, it is a bonanza that fuels an entire succession of life. At first, scavengers strip flesh with ravenous efficiency, but then bacteria take over, digesting bones and releasing sulfides that create localized vent-like conditions. Over decades, new communities form around a single fallen giant, a lesson in how the deep repurposes abundance into sustained, layered ecosystems. Bioluminescence is the deep's painter and poet, the method by which organisms create private light to seduce, warn, or disappear. The chemistry is simple and ancient in principle, luciferins and luciferases colliding to make photons in the cold dark, but its outcomes are endlessly varied. Some blink in fleeting Morse code, some create lures that hang like lanterns, and others use light to erase their silhouettes from above with counter-illumination. This play of light shapes behavior and life history. Predators evolve to spot the faintest flicker, and prey evolve to hide their light or to mimic the patterns of others. The dark becomes a theater of disguise and declaration, where communication through manufactured light can be as complex as the language of birdsong above the waves. The sensory world of the deep is not built around our familiar senses. Smell, in water, is a richer sense than sight in many places. Chemical gradients trace the outline of food, mates, and danger. Vibration travels well in the dense medium of seawater, and many species possess sensitivity to the faintest movements, reacting to a falling carcass long before it is near enough to touch. As you descend, time seems stretched. Food arrives in sporadic pulses from the surface, and life adjusts its cycles to scarcity, waiting and exploding into activity when opportunity comes. Reproductive strategies are creative. Some organisms broadcast clouds of eggs and sperm to chance, others invest heavily in parental care, and many have synchronized cycles keyed to seasonal pulses that subtly bypass the need for day and night. Gigantism and dwarfism in the deep feel like evolutionary paradoxes made visible. The deep sea hosts both colossal squids and dwarf crustaceans, each shaped by the peculiar economics of energy and pressure. Larger size can be advantageous in conserving heat or moving across sparse seafloor, while small size can mean lower energy demand and nimbleness in a patchy environment. The deep's biodiversity is nested in isolation and connectivity. Currents move larvae, spores, and microbes across vast distances, creating genetic threads between far-separated communities. Yet geographical features and depth gradients create pockets of endemism where species evolve in unique ways on seamounts, hydrothermal fields, and isolated basins. Seamounts rise like underwater islands, their slopes promoting upwelling and aggregation of life. They can be oases in the deep, attracting predatory fish, corals, and organisms that form rich reefs where currents carry nutrients. But they are fragile, their communities slow to recover from disturbance because growth in the cold deep is often measured in years, sometimes decades. Cold water corals are architectural wonders of the deep, building reefs and gardens without the warm embrace of sunlight. They anchor themselves on hard substrates and grow by trapping passing food, making cities of calcium carbonate that become refugee habitats for many species. These corals remind us that the deep can foster complexity and that structural habitats are as important as chemical ones. Microbes are the invisible architects of the deep, ancient and omnipresent, mediating the cycles of carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and metals. They form mats, slimes, and films that alter sediment properties and create niches for macrofauna. In their genomes lie adaptations that could rewrite our ideas about life's limits, including enzymes that work at high pressure and low temperature. The chemistry of deep waters carries tales of Earth's history. Sediments preserve pollen, ash, and microfossils that tell of ice ages and warm eras, of currents that shifted and continents that rearranged climates. Each core brought to the surface is a rolled-up chronicle of atmosphere and ocean, a slow ledger of changes that shaped the planet and the life within its waters. Human exploration of the deep is a tale of courage and curiosity. From early diving bells to modern remotely operated vehicles, each technology extended our senses into the abyss. The ingenuity required to survive the pressures and cold has led to machines that feel like mythic beasts themselves, tethered to ships by cables that are lifelines of data and power. Bathyscapes and submersibles are metal wombs, and their occupants are travelers in solitude. The first descents into major trenches were both scientific missions and voyages of personal courage, requiring patience, engineering, and a willingness to surrender to the unknown. Even with robotic eyes, the visceral experience of being under that much water changes how we think about distance and depth. Robotics has transformed deep-sea science, allowing cameras and sensors to linger where humans cannot, mapping landscapes with laser precision and taking samples from fragile habitats. Yet the machines bring their own footprint. Lines can tangle, cameras can scar corals, and physical sampling alters the very systems scientists study. This tension frames much of the ethical debate about exploration, how to learn without trampling. The deep is also a place of resource wealth that tempts industry, from oil and gas fields to manganese nodules and rare earth deposits. These materials sit locked in sediments or on the seafloor, unearthed by processes that predate human need. Interest in deep-sea mining has sparked arguments about the value of knowledge versus the value of ecosystems that evolved without human intervention. Noise is an invisible intruder. Sound travels far in the deep, and the mechanical hum of ships, the ping of survey equipment, and the thunder of seismic arrays can alter animal behavior. Sperm whales, squid, and fish that rely on acoustic cues can be displaced or stressed, and the cumulative soundscape reshapes the ecology in ways we are only beginning to understand. Plastic and chemical pollution do not respect depth. Microplastics and persistent organic pollutants sink, disperse, and concentrate in unexpected places, entering food webs and altering food quality. Even the most remote trenches have microplastics woven into their sediments, a sobering sign that human reach extends to the planet's furthest corners. Climate change touches the deep with slow but inexorable hands. Warming alters stratification, changing the delivery of nutrients to the benthic world. Ocean acidification reduces the availability of carbonate for organisms that build shells and skeletal structures, and deoxygenation creates dead zones that press life into compressed refugia. Methane hydrates lurk in sediments as frozen stores of gas that can be stable for millennia or suddenly unstable with warming. Their role is double-edged. They represent a potential energy source and a hazard, because destabilization could release greenhouse gases into the ocean and atmosphere. Scientists watch these deposits carefully, knowing that they are both evidence of past climates and actors in future ones. The deep keeps its own clocks, and some species appear to track cycles unknown to humans. Certain organisms follow pulses of food from seasonal blooms above, while others time reproduction to the subtle rhythms of tidal mixing. These internal calendars are a reminder that life adapts not just to place but to the tempo of resource availability. Symbiosis is a theme played out in the dark. Bacteria living in worms, archaea partnered with clams, and microbes embedded in tissues that provide energy otherwise unavailable. These alliances blur the line between organism and ecosystem, making life a network more than a single unit. Understanding these relationships changes how we define individuality in evolution's context. Sediment itself is an archive, and the laminae of mud tell of storms, floods, and seasons that once brushed the surface. The color and grain size speak of rivers and currents, while chemical imprints suggest productivity and oxygen levels in past oceans. Paleoceanographers read these tables of mud like detectives, reconstructing climates that guided continental glaciations and warmings. The deep's gardens of glass sponges and bryozoans create delicate landscapes, fragile and slow-growing, where each branch has taken years if not decades to achieve its shape. Fishing gear dragged across these fields can do damage that takes lifetimes to repair, and the slow pace of deep life makes recovery uncertain. These habitats are exercises in patience and vulnerability. The physiology of deep dwellers is a masterclass in biochemical compromise. Enzymes must function in low temperatures and high pressure, membranes must remain fluid yet not leak, proteins find ways to fold and work where our models struggle. Molecular studies have revealed adaptations that might be useful in medicine and industry, a bridge between curiosity and practical application. Biogeography in the deep folds into patterns governed by currents, depth, and substrate. Some species are cosmopolitan, carried by global currents to lurk in many basins, while others are island-bound, locked into a single ridge or trench. Studying these distributions helps map evolutionary history as much as geography, because genetic lineages carry the signatures of old separations and new connections. The deep has its own weather systems. Internal waves and tides move like atmospheric storms but are guided by underwater topography, stirring nutrients and shaping the boundaries of ecosystems. These movements bring life to hanging gardens and determine how particles sink, a choreography that coordinates life from the surface to the abyss. There are moments of spectacle that the deep unveils, methane plumes erupting like undersea geysers, microbial mats fluorescing in the dark, and squid engaging in ballet with changing patterns of light. These events are fleeting and often remote, but they remind us that the deep is an animate world, not a static backdrop. It is raw in beauty and in the mechanics that sustain it. The economics of exploration are complex and driven by science, politics, and private interest. Funding priorities determine which trenches are mapped and which vents are sampled, and scientists must often trade breadth for depth of study. The narratives we construct about the deep shape policy, and policy shapes which parts of the deep survive and which are altered for human gain. Citizen science and the democratization of data have shifted some balance, allowing the public to follow expeditions in near real time and to participate through imagery interpretation. This access changes how people feel about the deep, turning an abstract blackness into a place with names and faces. The more people know, the more likely they are to care, and care is a lever for conservation. Protected areas in the deep are possible but challenging, because the sea is fluid and the boundaries of an ecosystem are not always clear. Effective protection requires international cooperation, legal frameworks, and long-term monitoring, because enforcement in the abyss is logistically demanding. Yet when protected, deep habitats can retain their structure and functions in ways that enrich the planet. The technological horizon includes autonomous gliders with the patience of migratory birds, sensors that drift for months, and DNA samplers that read the signatures of life in a bottle of water. Environmental DNA reveals what passes through a place without needing to catch the organisms, offering a non-invasive window into biodiversity. These tools expand our ability to watch and learn without necessarily touching and tearing. Ethics in deep-sea science asks uncomfortable questions. Who speaks for voiceless communities living in the deep, and how do we weigh the needs of people against the rights of ecosystems? The idea of intrinsic value competes with utilitarian arguments about resources and knowledge. Navigating these moral waters requires humility and an acceptance that not all curiosity must become possession. There are cultural stories woven into the deep as well, myths that speak of monsters and salvation, of sunken cities and sea gods. These narratives are refracted through science now but still carry weight, because the deep has always been a metaphor for what we do not know. Story and science together can motivate protection and curiosity, each reinforcing the other. The deep is an archive of evolution in active form, where lineages persist and experimentation continues in isolation. Endemic species give credence to the notion that the deep contains living relics as well as ongoing novelties. Each new species described is a small revolution in our understanding of life's permutations. Mapping the seafloor is like cartographers exploring a planet's interior. Valleys, ridges, and canyons appear in the data and slowly become familiar. High-resolution maps reveal heart-shaped depressions, fields of collapsed pockmarks, and stretches of bedrock scarred by ancient landslides. These features inform science and hazard assessment because submarine landslides can generate tsunamis and redistribute sediments over massive distances. The deep's role in global cycles is understated in public conversation yet massive in effect. It is a reservoir for carbon, a sink for heat, and a slow-moving conveyor in planetary homeostasis. Disruptions to its functioning reverberate in climate models and will shape centuries of change in ways the surface world will experience in familiar and unfamiliar ways. There is an aesthetic of the deep, a beauty that is not picturesque in the sunlit sense but austere and profound. Photographs that capture bioluminescent swarms or mountain-like coral structures evoke a sublimity that can change the viewer's relationship to the ocean. That emotional response is an important currency when arguing for protection and patience. Scientific wonder mixes with personal reflection on long expeditions, where researchers return from months at sea carrying samples and stories of exhaustion, exhilaration, and minor miracles. Those long nights at sea, with instruments whirring and the hull creaking, produce a kind of intimate knowledge that cannot be captured in a paper alone. Oral histories of these trips convey the human side of exploration as much as any technical report. The future of the deep will be shaped by choices made now about industry, research funding, and conservation priorities. If we choose short-term extraction without regard for systems, the world beneath will change in ways that are hard to reverse. If we choose restraint and knowledge, we may preserve a realm of wonder and function that supports life on Earth. As you imagine the final descent, there is a psychological arc that mirrors the physical one. Curiosity turns to humility, then to stewardship. The deepest places of the ocean teach patience because everything there is slow and deliberate. That slowness is a form of wisdom, and to listen to it is to learn a different kind of timekeeping than our calendars provide. There are practical habits that arise from deep-sea science: meticulous sample handling, long-term data stewardship, and the cautious interpretation of sparse signals. Scientists learn to be conservative in claims and generous in sharing data, because replicability is difficult when the field site is 1,000 fathoms below. The culture of the science is shaped by rarity and by the cost of repeating experiments. Deep-sea ecosystems function on gradients and boundaries. Their edges are as important as their centers. Where currents meet substrate, there is life, and in those margins energy is exchanged and transformed. These ecological edges foster complexity and become hotspots of biodiversity that belie the monotony of surrounding plains. The sociology of deep-sea research communities reflects the logistical networks that enable exploration: ship crews, engineers, marine biologists, data specialists, and policymakers. Collaboration is the currency, and success often depends on the weakest logistical link being strong. These human networks are as critical to discovery as the instruments themselves. Inspiration for art and design flows from the deep, where forms produced by millions of years of adaptation influence architecture, fashion, and visual arts. The lattice of a sponge, the elegance of a jellyfish's bell, and the delicate filigree of cold water coral have all been translated into human objects of beauty. That translation is an exchange. Art borrows form, and attention borrowed in turn helps protect the originals. Long-term monitoring stations in the deep are slowly giving us continuous stories instead of isolated snapshots. Time series data reveal trends in temperature, chemistry, and biological activity that single expeditions cannot. These multi-year records are revealing subtle changes and helping to untangle anthropogenic effects from natural variability. The deep is also full of mysteries that may remain mysteries for generations: cryptic species that evade capture, unseen behaviors that elude observation, and chemical processes we cannot yet measure. Each unknown is both frustration and promise, an invitation to patient inquiry. The list of questions grows as we answer others, an expansive problem set that drives curiosity forward. Education about the deep needs to be tactile and narrative, because the abstract statistics do not convey the lived reality of undersea life. Storytelling, audio recordings of submersible descents, and visualizations make the depths legible and compelling. People protect what they understand and what they love, and education is the bridge to both. There are conservation success stories that offer hope: closed areas where coral gardens have shown signs of recovery and communities that have adapted fishing practices to minimize deep impacts. These examples show that policy and science can align to produce positive outcomes. They also show that patience and monitoring are essential, because recovery is slow on human timescales. The deep contains lessons about resilience and fragility, showing how systems can absorb disturbance up to a point and then reorganize into something different. Some shifts are reversible if action is taken; others may cross thresholds that change ecosystem function permanently. This fragility calls for precaution in decisions that affect the seafloor. There is a particular exemplarity to the deep that makes it a moral litmus test for humanity's relationship with the natural world. How we treat what we cannot easily see reflects priorities: exploitation for gain, or protection for posterity. The deep asks us to wrestle with whether knowledge obligates stewardship. New imaginaries of the deep include living with it rather than conquering it, developing technologies that observe and repair rather than extract and remove. This vision reframes exploration as partnership, where human activity seeks to tread lightly and to learn deeply. In that partnership, the deep becomes not a resource to be emptied but a tutor to be listened to. As the descent completes, the air of wonder accumulates into a quiet imperative: these depths are integral to the planet and to us, woven into climate and life cycles in ways we are only beginning to map. The final layers reveal that mystery is not a void but a frontier of stories, ecosystems, and technologies waiting to be known. To descend is to be changed, and to rise with knowledge is to carry back responsibility. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what connects with you more: the thrill of diving into the unknown or the duty of bringing something back to protect our world.